This is the Kick Aspirational Podcast. I'm Dave Vanderveen. This is season 3. And in this episode with philosopher and monetary policy expert, Aaron James, who teaches at UCI, University of California, Irvine, we had a wide-ranging conversation that lasted, for hours. And so this is a longer podcast. You may want to break it up into segments as you listen to it. I discovered Aaron through a mutual friend who went to Harvard with him, where he got his PhD in philosophy, Ruth Olson, and fell in love with his work. I'm a huge fan of philosophy in general. I studied philosophy in undergrad, and read it for fun on a regular basis. In particular, I love continental philosophy. I'm a fan of all forms of philosophy, actually, analytic, etc. But in particular, I enjoy reading more of the continental style, which is about existence and how we experience the world. And it ties in very directly to the work that I do in my life, which is fundamentally transforming experiences to build relationships that end up many times adding value to other people's lives and to my own. And I think it's a theme that we've talked about quite a bit here on Kick Aspirational. In fact, when we talk about building brands, we talk about the importance of authenticity. And one of the things that Aaron is famous for is he wrote a book called Assholes, A Theory, that's all about what it means to be an asshole, which means largely to be inauthentic, focused on yourself consistently, and putting yourself in front of everyone else that you encounter. The other thing that he's famous for is he has a book called Surfing with Sartre. And Sartre. Sartre was a French existentialist post-World War II who really helped us understand the world in terms of how we engage truth, beauty, etc. When if we didn't have the structure of a fundamental belief in a God or a higher power. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have that, but there's a lot of people in the world who don't have that same construct that many of us grew up with or enjoy. And so then how do you make sense of the world without that? So it was very timely post-World War II when a lot of people lost their faith. And it turned out, I didn't realize this, that Aaron's also an expert in monetary policy. He's just coming out with a book with a co-author. And he did a lot of work studying this at Harvard and continues to do work in monetary policy today, which may sound boring, but it's one of the most fascinating elements of our modern economy, particularly when you look at cryptocurrencies and what's happening right now with the federal bank and where that came from, how it operates today, and kind of a public-private relationship and how that impacts most of our lives, particularly in this post-COVID world. So we ended up going into a fairly deep conversation about that. Aaron does a great job of holding all of these plates we're spinning together. It's one of the deeper conversations I've had with anyone in terms of how we exist in the world and how that specifically impacts us in an applied philosophy, particularly in monetary policy in that sort of version of a political philosophy, the application of the ideas to life. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. It is a bit of a doozy, but it's one of the most powerful conversations I've had. They've been great this year in particular, but I just wanted to share with you. I thought I'd give you a little heads up that it's a little bit longer. We do have a couple of promotional codes. It's things that I actually use. One is we have a promotional code with Keto Super Coffee. Jimmy DeCicco was just on, or DeCicco was just on, using my Italian pronunciation there. And he's the CEO of Keto Life Super Coffee. And their creamer is one of my favorites. I just finished literally straight out of the carton, the sweet cream this morning. That's 0 sugar. It has 3 to 4 grams of MCT oil, essential fats, which are the fats you want in your body, and a few grams of protein. It's one of the best, most delicious sweeteners I've ever tasted, period. It does not have, it's lactose free, but not dairy free. It does use some whey. They are coming out with a vegan version, but they make some great canned coffees, great cold brew, and some amazing super creamers. So you can find them at drinksupercoffee.com. Use our discount code KICKAspirational25 to get 25% off. And the other one is where I'm working now at Noni by New Age. We want people to boost their immunity to stay healthy. I drink Tahitian Noni juice every day. Noticed a big difference in just the general wellness and feeling that I have. Pete Holmes is a new podcast as well that's coming out. He's working with us on promoting Noni by New Age as well. And he said, when he drinks it, he just feels this boost of energy, this power that comes from one of the most potent superfruits on earth, Tahitian Noni. And we're very excited to offer a promotional code if you haven't tried it to boost your immunity, particularly in these difficult times when our bodies are trying to fight off viruses and different types of attacks. We're offering a bottle of Tahitian noni juice and a bottle of our cell defense, which dramatically increases the amount of the antioxidant value in the blood. Together, those two things are some of the most powerful ways you can boost your body's immunity to potentially help your body fight off invasion. And the code that we have for that, if you'd like to try it, is go to noninewageCom/Roth, ROTH. It's one of our private banking partners that we work with, Roth Capital. It's a promotional code that we used for them and for people who are attending the Roth Capital Conference this spring, which was virtual. But if you'd like to try our Tahitian noni juice and our cell defense together, it's $120 value with shipping, and we will send it to you for $40, which is a huge discount. It's an $80 discount from $120. And we'd just like you to try it, see if it's something that you want to continue using. And if you want to continue using it, we have subscriber discounts for people that want to do that, and we can refer you to one of our distributors to help fulfill those needs. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the Kick Aspirational podcast this week. So this is a big one with Aaron James. It goes deep. You might want a notepad. It's one of the most profound conversations I've had, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So this is the Kick Aspirational podcast. I'm Dave Vanderveen, and today we've got Aaron James, the professor at UC Irvine, who has a pretty remarkable history. He has his PhD in philosophy from Harvard. You may have heard of it. And he's actually written some pretty cool books. One of them just got, was part of a review of a forum at Reddit. There's a forum at Reddit called "Am I the Asshole?" And Aaron was interviewed as part of that because of his book "Assholes: A Theory." He's also written about fairness in practice and our global economy. But my favorite book of Aaron's is a newer one, last couple of years, called "Surfing with Sartre." And if you're a fan of French existentialism, which I hope everyone in the world is, this is a book for you. And if you're a fan of surfing and French existentialism, it's probably one of the best books in the world. So Aaron, I want to welcome you on the podcast. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, David. Nice to be with you.
Yeah, typically we do these live, and you're sitting where today? Are you sitting in Irvine?
Irvine, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's we're not that far apart, but with the COVID pandemic, I guess we need to be.
Yeah, it may as well be the other side of the world, yeah.
So I met you via Ruth Olson, I should say that first, who was a Wheaton alumni. I guess I'm a Wheaton alumnus. I'm a Wheaton alumnus as well, although didn't quite graduate. Whole backstory there. You've written about assholes, fairness, and surfing as it applies to new ideas in existentialism in particular. I'd really like to explore those ideas and maybe how assholes who surf struggle with fairness in the water. I think that'd be kind of
yeah, sure.
John Wayne Freeman and I recently discussed the idea that maybe surfing is an inherently selfish sport that attracts more assholes than normal. I'm unclear. We can dig into that, but let's save that for a little later. I thought these are actually really good topics for this podcast because a lot of what you talk about is kind of creating meaning in the universe, creating the life you want, and breaking through barriers through the application of these ideas. And I think I'm getting this right. You can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it really is about kind of authenticity, self-awareness, the importance of these finding the creative flow and creative projects in our life, creating deep joy. Am I getting that right so far?
Yeah, going quickly. Yeah, yeah.
We're covering a lot of ground, but those are the synopsis, right? Why I think listeners should care.
Right.
And I'd like to get into your background, which I typically do. But before we go there, I kind of want to give away the end a little bit before we start, which is cheating, but I think it might help a lot of people. At the end of Surfing with Sartre, in your epilogue, you talk about sometimes you're at parties and you let people know that you're a philosopher, professional philosopher, I might add, and people kind of invariably ask, like, so what's the meaning of life, right? They're trying to be cute. And you answer that question. Can you help us understand?
Start with that.
How you break down the meaning of life?
Yeah, sure. So, I guess what the party trick that I use is to break down the question of a meaning of life. It's kind of a philosopher's trick. So,
hey, by the way, since we're doing party tricks, cheers, by the way.
Oh, yeah, cheers.
What are you drinking?
Whiskey.
Which flavor?
Whiskey, Jameson, whiskey neat. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Irish, nice. Well, a little Pernod here from
Yeah.
yeah. All right, so go ahead. So how do you break down
So people say, so I'm at a party and someone will say, oh, you're a philosopher. And then they say like, oh, what's the meaning of life? Like it's a stumping question. And I'll joke, oh, that's an easy one. Philosophers, we try to work on difficult questions, and they go, what? Like, Yeah. And so I say, well, okay. And they say, well, what do you mean? Look flummoxed. And so I say, all right, well, let me do I'll tell you what I think the answer is. But first, let me ask a different question. And then after we answer the different question, we'll circle back and ask the original question. And then, so the different question is, what are the meanings in life? What are the meanings in life? And now that's like, if you just ask that question, that's like not a super hard question to answer. Like, how do we do that? Well, we start out like, what are the things that just clearly add meaning to life? I mean, there's friendship, there's, not dying prematurely. There's, interesting projects. There's being connected with nature. There's parties, weddings, dancing, we can just get a list of things, just lists, we can go for a long time with that before we start to disagree. Right. So and then that doesn't matter because our lists could overlap to a large extent, but then pretty far down they could start to diverge, but that doesn't matter. We just have different lists. We can have lots of different lists as well, So in some sense, once you look at it that way, it's like if you're asking the meanings of life, it's like there's too much meaning. Actually, there's way too much stuff. Like the existential crisis, if as you will, is like you got to pick one thing. I mean, how I only have. What do I have? If I live long 100 years or whatever, there's no way. I mean, I easily have 500 years of stuff I can get interested in, right? So, I got to budget that down somehow to fit into the 100 years. Surfing, philosophy, and music, and So in some sense, it's sort of full and overflowing with meanings, right? Once you look at that question, okay, so I say that's the easy question.
Of choices, right?
Yeah, there's just right. There's just too many. There's too many good options. I mean, unless you're really poor and just struggling to get by. But even really poor people, I go to Sumatra every year, Nias, the famous surf spot, and hang out in very poor, visit poor villages and try to help a little bit. But they have very meaningful lives too. It's full of close connection with their villages, a lot of sports and games, and family, some of them go surf and family. It's someone will die unnecessarily and it's awful, but their lives are as nice, as ours in a lot of ways. It's not, and these are same as it ever was poor people. So it's so that way if you have low expectations, you're just happy with the meanings in life, then there's an abundance. Okay. But then you ask, the next question is, well, okay, the original question, what is the meaning of life? As though there has to be one meaning, or a super meaning, right? That's supposed to explain all the other things are meaningful, right? How could friendship be, or surfing, or art, or literature, or music be meaningful if it didn't somehow part of a story that is a story of the universe, that doesn't end in the universe spreading into a cool gas and absurd, so if you tell the big or heat death of the sun and everything just getting incinerated, tell me why it means something. It's okay, so but so the thought is or why are we so small, or something like that. How could friendship be meaningful given how small we are, in the vast expanse of the universe or whatever? Doesn't there have to be some cosmic narrative about the universe or such that to make having a friendship and surfing and music somehow make sense or something like that, right? And so then the question is, well, does it really? I mean, why does it? Life's pretty full of meaning. Why does there have to be one super meaning that explains all the other meanings? And then here's the kind of a trick is, well, look, if that's what you're into, if you're into super meanings, then hey, just stick that on your list. That's cool,
Not everybody is, but it's good if you are.
Yeah. No, if that's what you need, okay, cool. If you want eternity, if you want after death to go to someplace beyond the sun, to a heavenly realm that's disembodied, and there's allegedly a party, a banquet, and this party just is a fun party, but it never ever stops. Like, which for a lot of people sounds awful, right? Like a good party, like is like 5-6 hours, and you go home and like, and you just relax and you reflect. But this party just keeps on going. Okay, but if that's what you're into, like never ending party, yeah, never ending house music. After a while, I like house music, but not for like infinite amount of time.
For more than 6 hours.
Or if you like, karmic kind of graduation, like if you want to like live human life well and go through like work your way up from an ant to to a cow to a human being to a dolphin, like so you want to like, so okay, that's another way of like organizing. So it's like if you're like have a suitably, if we think that these cosmic meanings are just sort of super narratives, they're like grand stories, then like the awesome thing about stories is that they're pretty flexible. There's a lot of ways you can narrate events cosmically, the same events cosmically, and then endow them with the meaning that that story gives them.
Right.
So like here we can just be sort of pluralistic. And if you're a surfer, the surfer attitude, there's be like, hey bro, whatever you're into, whatever story you're, is like, gets you psyched. But you could also just have one where death is the end of it, and where we're incredibly fortunate to be alive, and every surfer knows what it's like to get a great wave. I mean, not just the best waves of your life, but even like an average day, like getting a really great wave and having this like profound sense of like the feeling of stoke for surfers, I think of as just an awareness of the fortunate coalescence between your skillful activity in riding the wave and the natural flow of the wave,
right? Which
is it's beyond your control and constantly changing, but you have to constantly adapt moment by moment to what the wave is offering you. And when things go well, there's a coalescence of your skillful, adaptation, changing moment of the wave and what the wave's doing. And then when, flow, like especially good movers or a good barrel, or like it all comes together, as we say, you're sort of aware that this like really fortunate, beautiful thing is happening. And then you just feel stoke. And so I feel like there's a kind of awareness of being caught up in that coalescence.
Right.
And then that's the stoke, because you're like, wow. And the feeling is like I'm so glad to be alive rather than not. Just for this, this is like reason enough to be alive rather than not is for this. And it's like, it's complete in a way that, but if like eating a cheeseburger is like a pleasurable thing, but it's not like, you're like, I'm so glad to exist just to eat this cheeseburger. It's like, maybe you're just coping with life, like
really depends on the
life
cheeseburger.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Or life kind of sucks lately and you're not so sure life's worth it, but like, okay, what am I going to do? I'll eat this cheeseburger for now, and then I'll cope with.
Life is down here, cheeseburgers here, hey.
Yeah. So that's that for the surfer. I think that they find that a lot of meaning sort of in the intrinsic sort of being part of, just connected to the natural world, and then caught up in a fortunate way, and attuned. Surfing is all about adaptive attunement is the big idea. So a joyful way of being skillfully adaptively attuned to nature, and then so really connected with it in a deep and enjoyable way. And that's all what you might call atalic, meaning the activities aren't done for any other reason except for its own sake, right? So that's what's intrinsically joyful about it.
You aren't surfing some afterlife or some
right
reward you're going to get down the road. You're only doing it to be right now in this moment, right?
Yeah, right. You're surfing for surfing's sake, for its own sake, right? And so even if it can be a little complicated if you're a pro and you need to make money doing this, or there's always mixed motives, like like you come out of a big tube and you're blown away and you're like, did my friends see that?
Or maybe they didn't, they don't believe you, which is
right. Yeah. Did that get on video, or like so there can be mixed, but we're just doing it for its own sake. So for the surfer, the idea that life is just, it's all about all of these moments that are just a set of these moments that are intrinsically worthwhile. And life is about just going through them in a kind of ebb and flow way. The tides come in and out, the swells come and go, and you're just kind of, when the waves are bad, you're doing other things, kind of waiting around. The waves are on, then you have these peak experiences. Or you take what you know in surfing about really living and enjoying life, and find that joy in other things, music or whatever. So like that kind of surfer attitude about life doesn't require there to be a big story like that applies after you're dead, that somehow makes sense of what you did, like no, the meaning of the event is it's complete in the sense that it doesn't need any larger story or larger justification or larger reasons to just be, the a full reason to be alive rather than not,
Right.
just in itself.
No
Yeah.
cosmology necessary for certain.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. Right. I mean, you could spin one if you want, like, but again, that would just be like just another story that, maybe is a good story or maybe not,
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, you could talk about the fact that there was a Big Bang, the universe is moving in a direction, there's all this energy, and the Earth is moving at 70,000 miles an hour away from the center. And
Yeah.
because of all that energy in the universe, energy happens on the Earth, and that energy is expressed in water, and that's why we get to surf. But at the end of the day, does it really add meaning to the barrel you got? Probably not.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, and it can be a theistic story as well. God can be orchestrating the whole cosmic, play of events just for moments like those, or like just for, and community around them and the other goods of life and things like that. I mean, so it can be a theological story, as the cosmic story can be theological as well.
Yeah.
The sort of argument that's implicit in the party conversation point is just that that doesn't have, you don't have to have that to have meaningful life, so the existentialists were wrong. So Sartre, for example, thought, he agreed with Dostoevsky and the other sort of religious thinkers that life could only be meaningful if God existed and had a plan. If God exists and has a plan, is meticulously sort of planned your essence. Yeah, before you were created, like an artifact, before you were created, God had your concept already. And then, the way like an artisan creates a knife with the concept of knife, and then this object is designed to be a knife and function as a knife. And it's good or bad if it cuts according to its purpose. And then, so that could be like a religious conception.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
There's this truth of you that exists objectively out there that you were formed from, and the question becomes, are you living up to this ideal of yourself?
That's right. So the way Sartre or the existential would call that is your essence precedes your existence. Your essence, your concept, it exists before you're alive, and then the meaning of your life, your being alive, the value of it just depends on living up to your essence, right? And then the religious conception, the theological one, is that there just is such an essence, and your life is a failure or not, depending on how well you achieve like your preordained purpose. And then the Sartre, the existentialists say, there just is no pre-existing essence. You're just alive. You're in a body. You're a self-conscious being. I think, therefore I am. Sartre was very fond of Descartes' slogan. You found yourself thrown into the world. You wake. You come to in the morning. And there you are. You got to decide whether to get out of bed or not. Right. You can't just say, well, I'll see what happens. It's up to you to choose. Am I to pee or not to pee? You exist. That's not a question, right? I mean, you could commit suicide, but you'd have to get out of bed to commit suicide maybe, or figure out how to do it with the pillow or whatever. So that's still choosing. So yeah. Yeah. If you could smother yourself, but that's actually hard to do. So that's your predicament, is your existence is there. You're choosing being. Now the thing, so he disagreed with the theological views in one way, but on the other hand, he agreed that there's no meaning, because there's no prior concept there's no meaning that's sort of for you in life beyond just what you sort of choose in absurdity, what the meaning you sort of decide to just arbitrarily choose. So you're like, I'm here, I exist, therefore I'll be a skier just because I need some kind of project to organize my life. And then I guess that could create a kind of meaning from within the project, but it's just because you've chosen it. And that's it. We're kind of bootstrapping our way. So the idea is that Sartre is just wrong about that, because he's wrong in the sense of he might be wrong that God might exist, but he's wrong in the implicit conception of meaning, which is that there has to be this theological or preordained conception of meaning. But that's like the surfer idea of meaning in life, is that there's no meticulous script or plan. There's meaning everywhere in the activities, like surfing, like talking with people, like dancing, like music. It's full of meaning. Life's full of meaning, and the existential problem is just having too much meaning. And you have to choose, but not in absurdity, in an abundance of options. Okay, music or surfing or philosophy, once you're well enough off, you have to, you've got some hard decisions to make about what to do with your life,
No, I think you're right. I mean, I talk a lot about, when I'm working, especially with younger, or anybody at any age, frankly, but anyone at a crux of change in their life, you're trying to figure out what to do next.
Yeah.
Jim Collins, I happened to get into an email exchange with Jim Collins years ago when I was at a major crossroads through a friend who had him at Stanford. he was a business professor there, and wrote some great books like Built to Last and Good to Great. But he has this Venn diagram where he says, he thinks what he calls your hedgehog concept, the thing that will probably give your life a lot of meaning and make you feel fulfilled and help you be successful is, what are you passionate about that you're actually better at than most people, and you can actually make some money at, so it's not just a hobby. Like where those three things intersect, that's probably where you should put your effort in life. It's one way to think about it anyways. And I like to point out that's a really simple idea. It's three circles, but it's really hard to figure out.
Yeah,
right?
right.
And I think that's the struggle is and it's maybe the wrestling with that is half the joy of living, is figuring out how we can continue, get better at those things. Do you believe in a meta narrative? Do you think, like, for example, that humans tell the same sort of cosmological stories with different kind of specifics?
I don't know if I believe in one per se, but I think a lot. Well, I guess there's a story of, you mean about my own life or about?
Yeah, like, Joseph Campbell's idea of like the hero's journey, or like, I guess every people's group in the world, regardless of whether they live near bodies of water, has a flood narrative, right? So I think it doesn't have to be one meta narrative.
Right. Yeah. So I guess I am pretty, about my own life. I think there's kind of a story of my own life I've seen emerge and come together just looking back, but it's not sort of forward looking. And I mean, now it kind of is. Cause I started out doing a lot of art projects, and then I grew up like a surfer, just crazy. And then I merged into philosophy, and then turns out I was good at that. But to me, that these are all like continuous. And then I became a pop writer, like as a side thing, aside from being an academic philosopher and stuff. But to me, like if I look back, if there's a through line on the whole thing, that like a story I can tell about what they all have to do with it. And it is about just really getting absorbed in creative activities and like doing them for their own sake, but gradually doing more ambitious versions of them because of the interesting challenge. So it's sort of getting into flow, and then in between kind of waiting. It's sort of like being just true to the creative process and then seeing where that happens to lead. And that just being like pleasantly surprised at the weird new directions. Like in retrospect, like all these various projects I've done, you couldn't plan it out ahead of time, but you can see connections, the way they all sort of connect together looking back, right? So in some sense, the story that you tell is like works better. You can see yourself, your life is writing a story or whatever, but it's not like it's planned ahead, right? Authored ahead of time. You're authoring it as you go. You're the author, right? You're writing it as you live it. And then it kind of like becomes obvious, more obvious looking back. I mean, nowadays, for example, my own life, like I know the script, right? In some sense, I don't know the details of it, but I can still be like, well, what now in this stage of life? And it's just, well, just pursue the creative flow wherever it's leading me now, and be open to what surprising direction that might take you, So recently I just finished a book actually about money and public finance. And it's philosophical stuff about the nature of money, but also about how
is that fairness in practice?
No, that's a previous book from 2012 about the global economy. I have another book about global finance that I'm going to write, but this is a very commercial press, written with a law and finance ace. And so it gets through like the technicalities of banking, central banking and accounting, but it has a philosophical view about characterization of money as a kind of promise.
Yeah.
Federal Reserve note is a promissory note. Note means promissory note. And we basically, the promise is the government will accept that in payment of taxes. Yeah. And then we spend those promises with each other. What's that?
For now.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a debt. It's a debt from the government, and then we pay our tax with it. And then we use it with each other, the debt, to settle debts between us, as long as we have confidence in the currency.
Right.
But what drives confidence is the tax obligations. That is because the government is threatening all of us with prison if we don't pony up the dollars. So dollars are like, but so like you can see why like money has confidence because of the fear of prison. But then that means that money can be created like any promise is created, just from nothing. Like Sartre would say, actually, like as long as I have standing, I promise to meet to talk to you, right? So I incurred an obligation in doing that, and you have a claim against me to meet you. But how did that claim and obligation come into existence? Well, just because I said so. I said, hey, I'll see you then, but that's a real change, as it were, that just comes from nothing. So money's all the same way. But anyway, so that was all. we can go into that if you want to, actually. But
I'm deeply fascinated by that. I mean, I think
yeah.
the like particularly cryptocurrencies. I mean, monetary policy in general is, I think, deeply fascinating if
Yeah,
you
yeah.
take the time to get into it. But
Well, yeah, we could talk about it too in connection with the pandemic, actually, because the Fed's been doing all kinds of unconventional stuff. But that's actually like a good example of this. So like for the last year, I wrote this book about money and public finance, and some of it was based on earlier stuff that happened in 2008 crisis. We're arguing about stuff that can be the new normal in the future. But we finished the book before the pandemic broke out, right? But then lo and behold, the central bank's already doing a lot of the stuff that we were suggesting, and other governments are doing some of the policy change. So it's like, and now when the book comes out, we'll be saying not why we can keep doing the same things that we're already doing. So it would look like a more utopian book, but now it's just reality, and we're just explaining why it's sustainable. So, but that's that's sort of, for me, the narrative of my like personal narrative of staying in the flow of creative projects and seeing where that comes, and then sort of watching things serendipitously unfold and sort of celebrating it. That's an example, actually, kind of being ahead of the curve on monetary policy, and then seeing, and then a crisis comes out that's, you know, a pandemic, and then all of a sudden we have the ideas that make sense out of it. That's just complete serendipity, right? So, but to me, that's like, that fits the story of like the thing I'm trying to do, which is sort of stay on the flow, in the creative flow. And similarly with the surfing book, actually, I argue for a kind of leisure capitalism in that book, as you know, like where we all work a lot less, but there's a basic income grant, and so it's economically viable. And we reshape the culture of work, give up the Protestant work ethic, and we all work, but less, but maybe half as much or part-time. Workaholics can work longer if they want to, if that's what they're into, but
that's they get their joy in life.
Yeah, if that's their sport, as it were. If for other people, more sports and arts and time with friends and family at the beach and stuff. But so I developed like that framework, but at the time when I wrote that, it seemed pretty utopian, because like people are pretty attached to work. They forgot that the 40-hour work week is a relatively recent innovation and achievement, and we can make the work week shorter, and other countries are even doing that. It looks kind of utopian, and then all of a sudden the pandemic comes. There's stay-at-home orders, and then workplaces are completely retooling, like family care, schooling it all gets retooled overnight.
Right.
And the first thing people do is they go to the beach, right? And like all at the same time, which is a problem.
Yeah. Well, in Laguna, right? We're a small town, 24,000 people, which is along Southern California.
Yeah.
And when everything got shut down, people want a place to go. It's sunny, it's warm.
Yeah.
So we got flooded with people from out of town, and that caused our town to lock down beaches, lock down access to public trails. And we had some arguments about that lately. But yeah, no, I think
it showed my thought about the book. There's demand for it. I mean, people are perfectly happy to reorient their lives around leisure. It's just, and in a less sort of dramatic situation, like we could pace ourselves, not all just show up at the same time. And Saturday and Sunday wouldn't mean what it means, like if we had a much shorter work week. Because I just go every day at different, often at different times. And then so I'll avoid the weekends, right? But some people get more in like their routines and stuff. So there's kind of but it shows that the demand was there, and that like, as long as it could be economically viable for people, it's not like people would be unhappy with this as a way of life. So anyway, so like what seemed utopian suddenly was real again for that argument. So like how to make it last is sort of unclear. It depends on our level of political resolve, and that raises a whole set of problems, questions of its own. But to go to the meta-narrative story, there's a sort of bigger story about economic development and the progress of civilization and humanity. It's partly related to the rise of capitalism, and then, which is, lifted, most of humanity out of poverty over the last couple hundred years, like to an extraordinary degree. And it, by the way, is absolutely what's made surfing and leisure activities possible. It's the only reason we can really imagine having lives like with as flexible around work. I mean, people work like in Indonesia and Sumatra, I see there, you might see like some of the really poor local surfers might surf a little bit, but if they've got to spend the day picking rice in the fields, like that takes up a fair amount of their time. They don't necessarily work 40 hours, and they have maybe more flexible work, but But
there's
it's
also access to food, right? I mean, it's all those things, because if you're busy doing a lot of physical activities outside of the physical work you have to do, you need a higher protein diet. There's a number of things
right. Yeah. Right.
you don't
Right.
have access to, right? I mean,
Right. So it's, in some sense, like the 40-hour work week, and then the success, the post-war era, with sort of unprecedented level of wealth, a new middle class, and reduction of poverty, low inequality. That was kind of the first time that had really happened. And then lo and behold, surfing catches on, and like other kinds of leisure sports activities. I mean, surfing is like emblematic of like what people did for the first time to sort of carve out a new way of life. If it's not about just plastics or, working your grandfather's job or whatever, so.
What's funny is, so I travel, not a different company, but, I used to own a business, and we're in 60 countries around the world. So I'm traveling constantly, and, Western or, more developed countries, the idea of a lifestyle brand's, fairly common now. There's a lot of that going on. We see it in the surf industry, action sports, et cetera. But when we go to, and if I go to countries where maybe they're the first generation out of, grinding poverty, the idea of a lifestyle brand is really hard to communicate.
Right.
And the problem is, I was just watching this afternoon. I don't know if you remember Curious Gabe from Surfer Magazine, but he and I do a lot of work together. And this afternoon we went surfing in the morning. So anyway, so we've been kind of quarantine buddies.
Yeah, cool.
So we went up surfing at Newport this morning, and then we had some things to do in Costa Mesa. We ended up having lunch at a place that outside, whatever. But inside they were playing Slippery When Wet, a Bruce Brown movie from 1958. Yeah. And the funny thing is, this is about a bunch of Californians, Kemp Aberg and some other guys, going to Hawaii to, live on like $1 a day or something like that, and surf all these breaks. And they're surfing Makaha in 1958 with nobody out, right? So you head high, it's not huge. It's just like a perfect kind of day at Makaha, which, as people don't know, it's the west side of Oahu. If you're light skinned, probably not the place you're going to pick to go the first time you visit Hawaii. Yeah. And, it was just fascinating to me, when you're thinking about that it went from, probably there's old paintings from the 20s and 30s when people were painting Laguna, where you'd see some like of those solid wood boards. I had Dick Metz was on this podcast, who grew up in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s in Laguna. Yeah. And the progression, particularly post World War II, when the 40-hour work week starts getting implemented, the idea of a weekend is a new idea. Right. Right. We actually have dedicated time off, so you can plan recreational activities. And then there's just massive innovation. Hobie Alter and a lot of the guys here, Grubby Clark, start really innovating with not only modern technology that comes out of World War II in the aerospace industry, but applying it to leisure. I mean, that's just a massive transformation in how people spend their time and think about life.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think of Bruce Brown's like The Endless Summer as a really seminal film. I mean, but the backstory for it, he also did it On Any Sunday, which is about motorbikes, Yeah. But that's the emergence of leisure culture as a backdrop to the 40-hour week, and then the new level of material prosperity in World War II. And then surf industry like pioneered with that, because like Endless Summer comes out, people think, see Cape St. Francis, the peelers, reeling off. And by the way, Malibu looks like that now again for the first time. Yeah. By the way,
so that movie is based on Dick Metz leaves Laguna, gets a tramp steamer to Tahiti. It's the only way you could get there, Foreign Legion ship.
Oh, I didn't know.
And ended up going around the world. It took him 3 years just hitchhiking basically, and working as gets a merchant marine card at some point. He discovered all these places, and he gets back here. He's friends with Hobie and Bruce. And he's like, oh yeah, well, here's the places you need to go. And they did that same trip in 6 or 8 weeks and shot the movie. But to your point, it's because
that's great. I didn't know that. And actually, Tahiti is kind of an interesting case because the first time I think surfing was documented, it was in Tahiti by Captain Cook and his crew.
Right.
Probably around Moorea, but they saw local Tahitian surfing and then wrote about it. And then some of the guys even tried it, like in a canoe. Yeah. And then so this is on the radio. It's like this guy writing in English, a British guy, says I couldn't help but this man felt the supremest pleasure being driven along so smoothly by the sea. It's really wonderful. But so these stories went back to Europe, like to England and France and stuff. And they were actually hugely influential because they at the time, the philosophical assumption, it wasn't the idea that you could be happy, right? That was, life was life, right? And then there was
nasty, British, and short, right?
yeah, right, yeah. I mean, you had your sort of class position that was cemented, and like the idea wasn't that happiness was available to anybody, for example, right? But then once people thought, that was for the afterlife, maybe, but what Tahiti suggested was this like paradise already existed on Earth, and but it was just down in the southern hemisphere. And then new political projects emerged that were based on the idea that like the point of society is to make the pursuit of happiness possible. And actually, Napoleon Bonaparte he originally wrote about happiness, like as trying to write a novel thing. Turns out he wasn't as good at philosophy. He wasn't like Rousseau, So he's like, oh, okay, I'll go in the military, Turns out he was very good at that.
Terrible utopian, but really good at dystopia. So
yeah, right. But the French Revolution and the American Revolutions both were birthed out of that news. Rousseau, was similar, a kind of dreamer, reimagining democracy, not around the concept of happiness per se, but that got was in the mix very much at the same time. And then an interesting tweak in the American Declaration of Independence that reflects it is that when it mentions natural God-given rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that phrase is a riff on John Locke, one of the social contract theorists like Rousseau, who at the time, he had a lot more to do with inspiring the American Revolution, but both had a place. So, but in Locke's phrasing, it was natural right to life, liberty, and property. And so the American founders just dropped property and they put in pursuit of happiness. And that goes directly, the backstory for how that could have got into place is the stories that came back from Tahiti about surfing.
Yeah, well, and later, I mean, not that long, you have Mutiny on the Bounty, you have,
Right.
I mean, you kind of think about it, if you're leaving, this Hobbesian world where life is nasty, brutish, and short, you get on a ship, which is like fucking a spaceship at that point in time. Yeah, and you end up in this magical place where the women like to have sex all day with anybody. Yeah. There's plentiful food. It's delicious, kills your scurvy, and it's warm, and you're on this tropical island. Why would you go back? I mean, it's
right. Yeah, I think so. I think of that as that kind of dream, like that goes to the foundations of American democracy, and there's a question about how to make it real, and then like for the early, first 100 or and a half years, or 150 years, then the Industrial Revolution caught on, and then people substituted time for just getting a little bit more money, and then then work, there wasn't a work week for a really long time, and but I think of the post-war decades as when there was sort of a new version of this like older idea, like the pirates idea. And in fact, this is what the Bruce Brown film inspired, right? So this new generation of surfers thought, wait a minute, forget conventional work expectations. We got time. I got a little bit of money. Let's go find waves. I mean, it sounds like this other guy you mentioned is like one of their very early pioneers in that regard, going to Tahiti. Right. But then I think of Indonesia as their culmination of this kind of period. Because they try out various places, and it's they go back to South Africa and they find Jeffreys Bay instead of Cape St. Francis wasn't as good, but or it gets destroyed by erosion or kind of messed up. But then Indonesia is the really big discovery, right? In the 70s, which is like a new concept of surfing perfection kind of thing. I mean, Tahiti is always pretty good or whatever, but so yeah, I think like when I go every year, I kind of think of that as like within that bigger story of sort of exploration and but anyway, so like the surf culture as a lifestyle, like developing lifestyle brands and ideals around the search, Rip Curl, for example. I have a friend who works at Rip Curl, and she's like, yeah, they say the search, and then we get off a little early on Fridays. It's like, they basically do the conventional work week, unless you're like the very top of the company and like the founder guys and
break.
They want, or the sponsor guys, they're pros anyway. So like, so it's not so. There's more of an understanding like within the industry about the values, but like the rest of corporate culture, there's these experiments, for how to like give people a lot more leisure, have flexible time so they can be more creative, more efficient about work, sort of have a better sort of balance of the different things. And even Germany and Switzerland have reduced their work week a lot recently on the theory that people are just as efficient in like 30 hours as in 40, because there's just a ton of wasted time if people are just stuck 8 hours per day.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Also, I think there's a lot, cultures really vary, right? So
Yeah.
I've lived in Germany, worked in Germany.
Cool.
They enforce a 35-hour work week,
Yeah.
and you get fined if you have people working over that. And they also have tremendous discipline in their culture, right? I mean,
Right.
if you have a dog in Germany, that dog will go to Hundschule and will be the most, that they are all obedient animals. It's
Right.
kind of crazy. Or if you drive on the roads, you don't drive slow in the left lane, or you'll get fine ticketed, and everyone on earth will tell you you're a bad person.
Right.
I took a global group of our executives when I was with Excess at Amway to Stance for a visit, because I wanted them to see what a lifestyle brand was about. And Stance was a newer company. This was a few years ago. I think they had just hit $100 million. And, they're in San Clemente. They've built this, they're in a tilt-up building with all these really kind of, the interior is amazing. They have these um, they've taken all these shipping containers and made them into offices, and they're stacked inside. They have a half pipe, they have a golfing range, they have a chef, they have basketball court. Because that culture, punks and poets, is part of who they are. So we're in there, we're looking at it, and the Western executives are like, this is amazing, it's what we should be doing. Our particularly Southeast Asian executives, who have more of a Chinese work ethic and come from a less disciplined culture, in many ways. They said to me, this would never work for me. Nobody would do anything.
Yeah.
And I think, I think to your point, like, the difficulty in a work environment is you want to give people all the freedom in the world to make great choices. And you want them to have those choices aligned with the enterprise so that we're all rowing in the same direction and accomplishing together. But the fact is, there's just not a lot of people that have the discipline in order to behave that way to make it work. And that's where it kind of breaks down. And that's why, people are, I've worked in startups, worked in a lot of different things. In a startup, you want to give maximum freedom. You're hiring super high talent.
Right.
You're giving people all these reasons to never leave work. You're trying to make work the best place to be. And, it sort of works in those environments if you get the right people and they're highly, highly motivated and they're highly disciplined. But when you break it down to a scaled organization, that can get really difficult. And, no, I just think it's a fascinating mix that we're working with, and the social fabric that you come from kind of informs the way that you can organize your work and your time.
Yeah, I guess, no, I think that's right. I mean, sort of what kind of accountability structures do you have to have in place so that like tasks that need to be done get done in the timely way? That's kind of, but there's like the kind of traditional model of the workplace is that you need everybody in the same building so that the bosses can watch them and police them. So it's like a jail model of,
it's the worst model, probably.
Like Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon was a prison in which like it's a circular thing, and you got prison guards in the middle, and they're all looking in at the prison.
As a prisoner, you can be viewed all the time.
Yeah, right? You can be watched. Yeah, so like that was for maximum like discipline and enforcement or whatever. So there's like this prison version of the work. No, that's exaggeration, but the reality is the boss is supposed to be watching, and but like I know a lot of but there is something to the fact that people, when they leave work and go to the same place, they get caught up in you're caught up with talking with your coworkers and the common projects, and so it does absorb you in a way that maybe you wouldn't be if you sort of didn't meet regularly or something, and differently than just having Zoom meetings. So there's something to it, but it's more like I think. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if you look at Microsoft as an example, the company did really, really well for a long time. It had a big kind of downturn when Steve Ballmer took over. It's this kind of authoritarian boss, right? And when it was recently taken over by he's an Indian, I'm trying to remember his name. I'll think of it in a second. Sorry, it's escaping me. But basically, the company was transformed from an authoritarian structure to a structure that is inclusive, is lifelong learning, and it fundamentally the way that the company was transformed, the way it's had this tremendous growth the last 5 or so years. Was through a focus on transforming the culture first, because if you transform the culture, the fabric that holds this whole thing together, especially a large enterprise, that's actually how you're going to transform it, not by KPI, analytical metrics.
Yeah, no, I think that's really key. I mean, actually, just to bring in a little bit of philosophy here.
Satya Nadella, sorry, that's the guy's
Oh,
name.
okay, yeah. I mean, this goes back to Rousseau, like sort of during that early modern period where we mentioned, Rousseau was writing at a time when democracy was tried briefly in the ancient world and was sort of seen as a failure.
Yeah.
And so up to then, they were just all like, they're all highly authoritarian, monarchies. All of society was sort of run in this really hierarchical kind of authoritarian way. And then Rousseau had experienced the city of Geneva, which was kind of an exception because it was a little bit more democratic. And he thought, or he'd heard stories about it by the time, and it kind of a little become corrupted by the time he grew up. But he'd seen, he got really pissed off at this whole thing in a way that's very familiar to Americans, liberty and freedom and equality, right? Those were all really foreign ideas at the time. And Rousseau, just kind of this crazy genius, also probably an asshole, but
but he was really kids may have been assholeish, right?
yeah, but a bona fide genius, like in this like almost drug-induced state, like has this like grand vision of democracy, and then and which at the time was utterly utopian, but it was sort of projected to be realistic because he had a different vision of human nature. So the older view of human nature, which Hobbes, for example, you mentioned nasty, brutish, and short, Hobbes's vision of what life is like without authoritarian rule, right? Then you're going to have an environment of mutual distrust such that people devolve into like warlike killing and scarcity and stuff. But so if you have a strong authoritarian hand controlling people, scaring the shit out of them basically with threats of punishment, then you can have order and cooperation. And Hobbes went so far as to think that unless that was a really strong authoritarian hand, like sort of social relations are inherently unstable. People are inherently sort of uncooperative. So you really need a firm hand to keep peace. So it's like a sharp division. It's either authoritarianism or war, and there's no in between, right? So, and Rousseau thinks, no, like people are sort of naturally disposed to cooperate. They can be made uncooperative or warlike, but everything depends on the context, right? So that his idea was that human nature we're not necessarily inherently cooperative, but we're not inherently uncooperative either. It can go either way, depending on how we organize society. So he imagines democracy around this idea, right? And then now the crazy thing is, this at the time was just pure out of nowhere utopianism, but then the French and American revolutions happened, and you get these long experiments, which in the 20th century you have the rise of democracy throughout the world. So, yeah. And that's now combined with sort of a revision with the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. Then, especially in the 20th century, you have new forms of like structures of workplaces that are based on the same idea. So it's more and more not the idea that you've got to watch and police people, and they've got to be a assembly line, and closely watch them, and they punch the clock.
Yeah.
Not that mechanical idea of like how labor is, but like, no, like a good workplace is going to have a culture and structure that facilitates creative like engagements, and like so there's more gradually like corporate sort of conventional wisdom has gone this more and more this direction, but that's all based on a Rousseauian idea of human nature that like and especially like making work more enjoyable or engaging people's creative ideas and or organizing incentives in that way. So there's more and more, that's the drift. But I think sort of we're gradually what's needed, but how to make it work in the detail, the thing that like if you actually have a company and you have employees, that's the kind of
it kind of goes back to Alexis de Tocqueville, right? The French aristocrat who comes through America in the 1800s, and he's trying to figure out why the American model, I think what he's trying to do is figure out why the American model is working at that point much better than the French model. They had been through a revolution after revolution after revolution, which Thomas Jefferson actually predicted in the United States and didn't happen, and kept happening in France until you get Bonaparte, who basically they're like, fuck it, we're going to have a bunch of generals take over here.
Right. Yeah.
And I what de Tocqueville says, and this has been repeated a lot, I'm not sure if it's entirely true, but I certainly seem to think that in business you see this, is he says, the reason that this works in America is they have a social fabric that allows this freedom to exist. Like if you didn't have this common belief structure, if you didn't have this kind of dedication to a common culture, you wouldn't be able to have the liberty and freedoms because you wouldn't have the common cause in a way. I think when you look at Russia as an example, right? There's a country that's always been under the boot of somebody. They've never really had, in my opinion, they've never really had like the empowering culture that we had in the colonies in America prior to the revolution. So whether it's the czars or whether it's the Bolshevik Revolution, which ends up in, a totalitarian state, or whether it's the new authoritarianism of Putin, you basically are, a really interesting fact when in Moscow, the ruling mayor of Moscow will always have about 80% approval ratings until the day he's not the mayor of Moscow, and then
Yeah.
20%. And it's not because they're fixing or cooking the numbers per se. It's more because the Russian mentality tends, not everybody, but it tends to favor whoever's in power. That's who they're gonna look to, favor, and approve. Because
people won't say what they think. Yeah.
well, it's not even. I think it's not even that. I think it's that it's like Crimea in the civil war in Ukraine. The Crimeans weren't arguing about liberty. They were wondering. They're just arguing whether Kiev is going to give them more or Putin's going to give them more, right? When you're in a slave mentality, if the average Russian is making $300 a year, the average Ukrainian is making, $300 a month, or the average Ukrainian is living off $300 a month, they're in grinding poverty. They're really not thinking about liberty and whether or not they can go surfing and all these wonderful things that they could do with their time. They're just wondering who's going to give them the most stuff. And I think so. In that worldview, in that culture, it's hard to understand. Growing up in America, where we have this totally different worldview. But if that's where you're coming from, whoever's in power is who's going to get your vote, because that's where the good things come from. Until the day they're not in power, and then you're like, get them out of here. Who's next? Who's giving me the good stuff again?
Yeah, I think it's probably right that the Protestant work ethic in America did a lot to sort of for social cohesion and to make like capitalism is kicking in, like the Industrial Revolution sort of kicking in and creating a lot of new pressure. So like the age of the kind of yeoman farmer and self-sufficiency and a no class structure, and everybody, there's enough land for everyone to sort of build their own life, and then and sort of in condition of equality and independence without anyone dominating anyone else. Kind of that period, I think, is real, but it was a fairly short-lived, because sort of larger finance and larger property acquisitions, even in the farms and stuff, sort of caught on fairly fast. And then so I think there's a period like the later 19th century, which much more like bigger industrial capitalism. And then it wasn't until the progressive era and the pushback against that, you had the beginning of the 40-hour work week and like other forms of social insurance kicking in to sort of make things a new social contract to sort of have a better, have capitalism better align with the aspirations of a democratic republic, like the good ideas, right? Like having the economic structure capping up to it. But the Protestant work ethic, as you say, probably did have like a good role at that point. But one thing I think is that now it's sort of become, it might still, if it does have still some benefits, like we're overshooting and it's harmful in a lot of other ways.
Well, it's kind of like how the Calvinists, who were Protestants, basically, kind of eradicated surfing from Hawaii because
right.
it was a waste of time, right? Like why would you? It's almost like, why would you be living in the moment?
A waste of time and immoral, because
focusing on this,
right. Where the stand-in for the heavenly bliss is getting money now, because that's the sign of sanctification.
Right. But it's also why people tend, people who are workaholics, and I've been guilty of it at different points in my life. The reason you work so hard, the reason I would work 3 jobs in the summer when I was, in school and stuff like that, was because I was like, look, I don't want to work during the school year. So I'm going to work 3 jobs in the summer. I'll find time. I'll work different shifts, and I'll find time to surf and do different things. But I want to work my ass off now so I can be lazy later. And I think you've got those same kind of mechanics in a lot of people's minds. I'm going to work now so I can have this epic retirement. And no one's even thought about, well, what are you going to do when you're 65 if you haven't been fit, if you haven't been skills for a recreational future? What are you going to do with all that money?
Right.
Have it.
Well, I think that's the way. There's there are good changes like retirement and 40-hour work week and vacations, but I don't and like the leisure culture and the new corporate experiments with it are all good, but I don't think that we've totally sorted out how it's all supposed to work, for the reason you mentioned, because people don't really live up to it, or they have an idea. Okay, like there's an idea of celebrating the entrepreneur, who makes his money young and early, does a startup, and then cashes out. But then, the guy's sitting in a cafe bored and like, what now? Doesn't really know.
I talk about that. Like, I've been traveling for most of my life as part of my work, and my wife's been supportive of it, and it's been kind of how we exist. But like, it got so bad at a point where I literally felt like I was becoming some horrible kind of version of an existentialist, where I wouldn't even want to look at my calendar because it would freak me out, because I was
Okay.
always in a different country, always in a different place, always doing
Yeah,
something.
yeah, right.
And so I just started saying, look, all I'm going to look at is this app I use called TripIt.
Mm.
And TripIt will tell me what I'm supposed to do every day. I'm not even going to look. I'm not looking more than a day ahead. I'm only
Sure.
focusing on right now. And part of my role, there were a lot of people that I was working with, a lot of small business owners that we were working with, and so a lot of events that we were doing. A lot of times there were parties. I do 3 parties in a day sometimes, or I'd take a bunch of people surfing. I took like 1,000 people surfing in Hawaii over a week.
Yeah.
It was weird shit that I was just doing, and sometimes there'd be a photo session where you'd have to do like literally 2 hours of photos with people where they want to get a picture with you so they can post it on someplace.
Yeah.
And not that I'm famous outside of the little world that I'm in, but in that world it mattered. And so people want a photo. And somebody was like, well, how do you, don't you hate taking photos for 2 hours? And the thing I had to keep doing is saying, well, it matters to this person and it matters to that person. And that person, they each really do matter.
Yeah.
And so if you can force yourself to be in each moment right now with that person and not worry about the 2 hours of it, or not worry about the lineup,
Right.
then it's actually really special and amazing and cool. But you have to, in order to zero in on the moment, it's really, really hard, right?
Yeah.
And that became like it kind of informed a lot of, I've always been a fan of existentialism, but it really kind of helped inform how to think about living in this new kind of world and era that we live in. How do
Yeah.
you,
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh yeah. I was thinking because like what ideally you have structures that allow us to like organize our lives over the longer run, but that permit a lot more time for just being present in the moment and valuable activities with others or creative pursuits or even interesting work or, as well, that's the ideal. And then the sort of how to work out the details of it is an interesting question. But this one reason the pandemic is kind of exciting because, because all of a sudden you have this massive cultural experiment because workplaces, schools, families, all retooling all this stuff. And no one thinks, okay, this is permanent or whatever, but the stuff that you find out that now works or is workable, like that's not going to be forgotten necessarily. There's a new sense of possibility. So it's not that everything just winds up like right back where it was, with a new sense of like now what's possible. So, I mean, in some sense, like there's not a preset answer, but now the sort of the space of possibilities is much more open, I think, than it was before.
Absolutely. And that was kind of, I guess that's where I was going with that was, when we sold our company and I had a lot less to do and then I wasn't really doing very much for a while, it was the worst thing on earth. And I was talking to Danny Kwok, who was, helped start Quicksilver and then Volcom, or at least Quicksilver in the US and then Volcom. And he was saying, the worst time of his life was when he had to sell all his Quicksilver stock because he was involved with Volcom and he didn't have an active role at Volcom. And, so he made a ton of money, cashed out the peak of the Volcom, Quicksilver's value, and owned a big chunk of Volcom, and, bought a place at the ranch. And he was like, I was miserable. I had no idea what to do every day. And I think, it's that redefining our existence is always difficult. I was talking to my wife about, being home for, looks like it'll be a couple months at least, probably a lot more.
Yeah.
And, we're fortunate. We live in Laguna Beach and we have Bluebird Canyon behind us. And, there's spots in the ocean we can get in the water still. But, part of what I've been posting a lot about and talking about is just, it's amazing just discovering what's in your own backyard. I mean, all these mountain bike trails I've never even hiked that are just, there's caves, there's all this wonder and mystery up there.
Yeah, this is another theme that I try to get into a little bit in the book, the surfing book, that I think something the surfers implicitly know, but it really matters for life in this way. But that life is not just about pursuing like the peak experiential state, like the peak flow state.
Yeah.
But the ebbs and flows, it's like this back dynamic, right? And like part of a meaningful life is just about being patient and persistent through the ebbs and the flows, like the tidal changes, the swells come and go. I mean, surfers really has a sense of this. And that like, there's some surfers who are always chasing like the, big wave surfers always, each month of the year, they're on the big wave spot and they're like, extreme mountain climbers kind of thing, but that's kind of fairly exotic from the point of view of most surfers' understanding of what life is.
Sure.
It's like, and that the analog in creative life is that, I mean, it's wonderful when you're like, all certain ideas are coming together, like a book project or some other kind of productive project. And like, suddenly you're finding yourself really smart and like connecting all kinds of stuff. That's wonderful and beautiful when it happens. But what sets the stage for that is like often long periods of just being in the ebb,
reading and thinking,
yeah,
and
reading and being around, sitting around your house and lazing, loafing, vegging, cruising, just like not knowing what to do with yourself.
it's Don Draper taking a nap.
Yeah. I've been binging on TikTok actually the last couple of days. I absolutely love TikTok all of a sudden. That's so awesome. But anyway.
Can you give me 1 second? I'm going to take a quick bathroom break and I'll come right
sure.
back.
Yeah, just add to that, I mean, it's a mistake, I think, to see like leisure as just resting to recharge the battery. So
Right.
you've like juiced up for work. Because it's not just it's instrumentally important. I mean, like sometimes looking back, I can see like, yeah, it was this down period in which I was disengaging from some other project. Like I finished a book or whatever. And then I start to like, I don't totally know what I'm doing, but then like the ideas start to coalesce and you think, oh wait, I got now I've got this, or you pick up a new interest or you explore some new things or some things crystallize. But it's kind of in a more relaxed kind of passive state where you might kind of find yourself wandering or even boredom is often a sign that, this is one view about it, is that it's a sign that you're sort of your values as you understand them now aren't they need to be further refined. They're sort of out of match with your current situation. So you kind of, and what you're doing is
anymore, right?
So you're kind of refreshing your values, but you have to do that as like, you have to kind of relax your plans and be open to sort of see new things or consider new priorities or kind of like, and that's just a period of time that goes through. So like, you don't have to get like, the existentialist view of those periods is like, life is absurd and it's meaningless. And like, I have to just create from nothing, some meaning somehow, like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill and self-defiance, like raging against but the surfer attitude about it is more just like respecting the cycle of ebb and flow. And then just being patient through it, like, okay, yeah, the waves get bad and small, like, and then it's going to get good again, but you just wait and like play guitar in the meanwhile or whatever, like.
Yeah, well, I mean, Camus is the myth, and talks about the myth of Sisyphus and this meaningless pushing a boulder up a hill. And I mean, I think Camus is quite famous for saying, look, yeah, the universe is absurd. Don't look for some super narrative or meta narrative.
Yeah.
Our job is to put meaning into the universe through what we create, right? Is that right? Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's Camus' version, but that's a definite existentialist. Yeah.
And I guess, to your point, I think when our values cease to inspire us, we might sense this boredom. But I think, I was raised in this Dutch Calvinist Christian Reformed tradition, but, my parents would say only boring people are bored. Like if you're not, which is kind of like a strangely existentialist idea, right? That if you're not actively putting out creating,
pursuing,
then maybe you're the problem. And I think
that goes, there's a weird mix actually in Sartre, another, like maybe it's in Camus too, I'm not sure actually, but his idea, but that, your future is up to you and it's yours to choose. Right. And your fate doesn't determine you. But now, so there's this burden of sort of responsibility for choosing yourself. But now you have no guidance. That's anguish.
Right. You're just staring into the void, making random choices.
Yes. So there's like you just have to like go work and just do stuff and make, push just like, but if there's something you want to happen, you can make yourself into it, kind of. And now like for people that are like, maybe not already kind of active and switched on, that can sound liberating because it's like, oh wait, I don't need permission. I can just go be who I want to be. That sounds freeing, right? But if you're already fairly switched on, it's like exhausting to be like, recreate myself again. Like what, like, again, I've done that so many, like more, like when is enough? When do I stop? When do I just relax? And like, so there's like a Sartre's idea of being is sort of overly active, I think. And it's like the Protestant work ethic. You're just always constantly striving to kind of to make your life create meaning, as opposed to just relaxing and being and taking it easy and being present in your environment and attuned to the ocean, attuned to the people around you, and without trying. So like there's a more Buddhist like ideal that goes too far in the direction, I think, of giving up the self or the idea of self entirely, or giving up desire or any form of attachment, which can be valuable, I think, too. But there's a way in which the existentialists are sort of still like very much like similar to Protestants, Christianity, and and missing out on a lot of of just simple being and enjoyment of life that surfers understand in a deep way.
Yeah, no, I have a joke. Pete Holmes is a comedian. He's a friend of mine, and he was just on the podcast. And years ago, we had been talking, and I told him about a religion that I thought was becoming more popular called Venism. It happens to, rhyme with my last name. And and I said, it's somewhere between Dudism, which is like from the Big Lebowski, but it's probably more athletic than that, and Jediism, which is great, but also quite dangerous. It's somewhere between the it's more athletic than Dudism, but less dangerous than Jediism. It's somewhere in there. And had a few simple tenets, heavy drinking, light reading, and drugs. And and he really liked that. He made some stickers from it. But we were talking about some of those things, and I said, I think the point is to kind of find some middle place between, this extreme commitment to constantly creating and having this body of work that you want to show the world when you die because somehow that's going to matter, versus letting the world just happen and having some fatalistic approach.
Yeah.
To your point, look, when you do like LSD or mushrooms, the beauty of it is that I think it kind of awakens you to this childlike wonder that you had a long time ago that you forgot about because your brain's been so busy categorizing the world.
Right.
You get to see things, right? And so when
philosophy does that to you, by the way, when you're
yeah, right. But it's a lot of fucking work. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. Yeah,
you don't want to be on an acid trip your whole life. Yeah, you want to go there, and then you want to come back because you need to rest. And the categories that we create, it's kind of like when you talk about attunement, right? As I understand it, I may be getting this wrong, so correct me. But it's this idea that it's kind of like Blink. Malcolm Gladwell wrote about Blink, where there's these, when you put in 10,000 hours in a thing, you start to have this innate intelligence that's half learned, and probably you have some native skill too. But it's really like you've done this so many times that you can instantly recognize things without having to go through a T-chart of rationalizations about what it is you're doing. Yeah. Ian Cairns is a friend of mine. He was talking about, he's with the Bronzed Aussies, in the 70s, created surfing. He was talking about Shane Horan, who, Ian's very, very analytical. He's always trying to overthink. When he would do like a surf school with our local surf team, my kids would be sitting on the beach at Uppers, at 6 a.m. with a notebook, mapping out the surf break and documenting it, which is, I guess, what he had, part of what he had taught Tommy Curran. Because if you sit there for 30 minutes and kind of document what's happening with this, you'll see patterns. And then when you're out there in your heat, you'll recognize those patterns. You can take advantage of them. That's great if you want to be a pro surfer and you want to win a heat and all the glory that comes with that. He said his biggest problem in surfing in his career was overthinking everything. He was probably terrible at multiple choice tests. And I think, he said the beauty of Shane Horan was just that, in his opinion, Shane wasn't that smart. And it wasn't that, and I would say it wasn't that Shane was stupid. I think it's that Shane had a different sort of intelligence. Right. That was much more intuitive, that was much more about the 10,000 hours. And he could do these beautiful, amazing things that Ian couldn't do because, to Ian's point, he didn't think about it too much. He allowed his innate intelligence to drive him, and he didn't have to overanalyze it every time. Yeah. Your point, is that kind of what attunement's more about? Yeah,
actually. So I think I'm right now, I teach an introduction to ethics class, a big intro to ethics course. I'm teaching it right now, actually, but an online version of it. But it's about ethics in light of knowing the difference between know-how and knowing that. And within ethics, going back to Aristotle, Plato, and then up through like other figures like Kant, this is like an important difference, like how you think ethical understanding, knowledge, and intuition, and how it relates with whether know-how is like virtue and it's like or whether it's like an intellectual kind of achievement, knowledge. And then so that fits the attunement idea, because I do think that attunement is a way, it's achieved via skillful activities and being present with things and it can be facilitated by what you believe or what you like through cogitation or or intellectual understanding that can guide it, but a lot at its best like that sort of falls away because you're just absorbed in the like intuitive engagement, automatic, spontaneously engagement, sort of in the flow. So I think of it as there are these, they kind of go back and forth, and then there's ways in which a culture or a person can be disposed to overdo the one or the other, sort of over intellectualizing things, and they can become out of attunement with like so lots of obvious things like other people or they're present and then on the other side of it, somebody who like doesn't have an understanding of things like that's maybe intellectual, they can sort of lose sight or find the familiar, not really understand it or be able to see new possibilities or create obstacles or something like that. So yeah, I think definitely there's a kind of deep interplay between knowing how and knowing that, that's really important in life, and a lot of, well, yeah, it's really important in life, and sort of, but to connect it with the idea that the flow is like you're completely absorbed, and then the ebb is when you're kind of reflecting back and understanding. Yeah.
I wanted to ask that. Do you think, it seems like the knowing that, I mean, if I'm reading you correctly, it's the knowing that, which when we reflect should kind of inform how we structure the knowing how. Is that right? Is it more?
Yes. And this, but not just that independently, but the things that you come to have an implicit awareness of when you're really absorbed, that is something that you can't necessarily be fully explicit at the time. Right. But later on the reflection, it's something you can like have a reflective awareness, so you can have a knowledge that, and then think about its value and importance and connect it with other things. And yeah, so that's a lot of philosophy actually is, I think of as sort of just that kind of backing up on things that in ordinary life we get absorbed and attuned to things, in the kind of know-how way, but maybe losing sight of like its point or meaning or something like that.
Well, I think that's why comedians are kind of modern day philosophers.
Oh yeah, I agree with that.
They're stepping back and reflecting on things that we take for granted that we just do every day that we don't really think about, and they do it in a way that catches our attention because it's funny. And
they have an incredible skill too, which is like a way of communicating like these philosophical reflections. I think they're a good example. Every time I think they're super philosophical, the best comedians. I'm always amazed. I mean, they're way better than philosophers, and so they're not good at philosophy as philosophers understand it necessarily,
right.
But that's that's a demanding enterprise, right? That's not standing up in front of people who've been drinking and like in 20 minutes, like conveying like a full gestalt and an awareness and an open, and doing that is like incredibly hard, right? So that's its own knack, but it comes from, I think, an awareness like irony or detached or kind of like a reflective place that is a lot like what philosophers are often trying to achieve and crystallize by their own methods.
We've been talking about this meaning of life, and I think this is really fundamental to help people break through barriers and put meaning into their life. And in your epilogue, one of the things you talk about is Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch and being in the moment. You quote him, you say, it made every moment of life eternal. The past has not ceased to exist, and the present's not vanishing as we live through it. Every moment of our being is real forever. And the Übermensch is the being whose capacity for self-affirmation will enable him to rejoice at this thought.
Yeah.
And that really, I just finished a book not that long ago called Paris in the Present Tense by Mark Halperin. And it's a great book about this music professor. I don't know if you know Mark Halperin. He writes kind of magical realism, but
oh, right.
It's this music professor who's discovers in Paris through his own, it's not a big secret, he dies in the book, but through his death, that the entire history of Paris actually happens in this moment all the time. Like everything that's ever happened is always happening. It's always
that's it. Yeah.
Does that tie into this whole concept of attunement, that when we're truly deeply present in the moment, it's kind of the Buddhist version of enlightenment, I guess, in some way. And I think enlightenment gets overblown. It always seems that people can't work for it. You almost have to discover it.
Yeah.
Like getting food or those sorts of things bring you there. What is that? Am I getting
I think that's the thing that the surfer knows in like from the tube ride or like the really absorbed ride is like a complete sense of presence. I mean, it's not necessarily, there's a question of what Buddhism requires or whatever, but if it requires complete self-transcendence, like a complete loss of any self-concept, then so you have no mind or that's not something that's necessarily achieved. Because like even in the best barrel or whatever, I'm like still shifting my weight, right. Or I'm like duck, like the curl.
Yeah.
I'm watching the lip a little bit, like, so I'm completely absorbed and time standing still, as they say. That's like complete absorption of the moment. But then I still have to think about my body position. And the way I think about that is like, it's a completely flexible thing. So I'm not like thinking about myself, I'm thinking about the whole moment, but then suddenly I'm thinking about my shoulder or the lip line or next to my head or my hand. Like, so like, it's a kind of flexible awareness of self versus complete absorption. And you're going back and forth with that. And apparently that's characteristic of elite athletes in general, and maybe a lot of creative activities. But so I don't know if the Buddhist ideal is that,
athlete?
What's that?
Are you an elite athlete?
Oh, I don't know if I am anymore, but you know, I get big long tubes in Indonesia, so on shallow reef. So
No, your barrel shots are amazing. I mean, high recommend. I mean, people may not take you seriously as a philosophy professor who surfs. You know, there's a Peter Kreeft who's, you know, claims to be a surfer. He's an amazing classical scholar of Boston College, but he rides a boogie board, which always made me, you know.
Yeah, I didn't know he was a surfer, or claimed to be one. Yeah. But yeah. Well, I know I started surfing first, so that to surfers that'll mean something. Yeah, what did I do with my youth is I was just surfing and I didn't give a crap about ideas.
Wait, so your point is, it's like Sean Thompson. Sean Thompson's actually pretty good at this. He talks about how he actually was riding in the barrel where most people are just trying to lock in and go. And you're saying to the same point, like when you're actually in a barrel and you're not just freaked out trying to, you know, find your way out of the hole, when you're actually in a great classic open continuous barrel like you find in Nias or other parts of Indonesia, I mean, that's when you can actually not just be in a barrel, but kind of become one with that energy in a bit.
Yeah. I mean, like, well, at Nias where I go, there's like some of the good ones are like, you just drop in and you just stand there and you know you're getting drained. It's like giant and wide open, right? So you know you're coming out, you know, like and then you don't have to do that much, like except like not get too cocky or whatever.
Don't let it punk you.
Don't get too cocky, but most days you can get really good tubes, and when it gets better with swell you can get really long ones, but you got to do a lot of threading, you know, through like the compression of because it's kind of a high tube, so like the double ups as they'll say will have like be round and open the whole thing, but other ones will be like
pinchy.
You know, they'll have pinchy sections but then open again, so you got to thread through that. There's a lot of like flexing, and the best tube riders, they're like just doing that just constantly, you know.
They're reading the energy in the wave and what's going to happen with the backwash, and they're maybe keeping a high line and then dropping down and then getting a high line to get through it, right? I mean,
yeah. Absolutely. But so like that's, but to relate to the philosophical idea, the thing that surfers like celebrate in those kinds of ways of being present, I think is, it is the kind of thing that like Nietzsche is after, I think, is like, it's the idea that the meaning of life can just be in those kinds of moments, you know, but it doesn't mean that like, well, the deeper point is when we were talking about meta narratives, like, and I was saying that like in the personal life, I can tell a story about my overall sort of journey or whatever. And then I mentioned capitalism and development and toward leisure culture, but notice both of those are putting things in terms of a calendar.
Right.
Time.
Structure. Yeah. Strategy and structure.
The story structure we tend to use the calendar, to put it in a sort of temporal sequence. But you don't have to do that with a story per se, but we just tend to, like, so the narrative structures, the ways we tend to sort of construct meaning is often around calendar time, like as a sequential thing. But now physics doesn't recognize anything like calendar time, like as real. There's nothing real about it.
Time's not real in general, right? I mean, if you read like,
well, it's real. Space-time is a real concept in physics, but it's not that close to what we ordinarily talk about as time.
But until you break it down, right? I mean, if you break down, every time you break it, the smaller you go, the less time there actually is. I mean, entropy is maybe the most specific way of looking at time.
Honestly, the most I can say about it is that, like, with any clarity about the physics. So once you start looking at physics and what it says about space-time, and you start looking at how they really sort of the mathematics that are really supposed to define the concept, it just doesn't have any connection with, it just doesn't connect with
how we view
it. Our common sense concept.
Right. I mean, most of our concepts of time are man-made. They're
yeah. So our sort of concept of time that's shaped by psychology, and sorry about this.
Okay.
I tried to just hang up, but didn't work.
Is it a booty call? Do you need to go? Are you good?
Boy, so hard to unsell these devices. Yeah.
That's all right.
Sorry. So it just doesn't map onto this. So we have an experience of flow of time, and then we have a social structure that's organized around calendar time.
Right.
And basically that's so that we can, so it's more efficient to make meetings. So strangers won't miss each other. Like that's like the whole fucking point of the calendar. It's just so we can have meetings.
No,
Like,
it was made in Switzerland, right? I mean,
yeah, I don't know actually.
it was created in Switzerland.
Now, like, I'm not denying like its importance for like all kinds of things, including creating the leisure culture that we're celebrating for and everything. So like, but the philosophical problem is that we mistake a convention or things that are true within the conventional structure. Like, what time is it right now? So I say, okay, it's Thursday, 6:35 p.m. That's only true within a calendar structure. Like, but even like worrying about being middle-aged or whatever, like how many so many years, that's arbitrary. There's no independent.
No one has any idea. Each person has no idea how long they're going to last, right?
Yeah, right. No, right. For your own lifespan, it's like doesn't track on the calendar time or the averages, statistical averages about lifespan. Even if you just happen to be like, in your 40s or whatever, you don't like calling that middle age is like just picking on that number of years, like those solar rotations. We could be thinking of years as like every 2 times around the sun, that's a year, or every half time around the sun, that's a year. We could, like, the unit of measure that we use is arbitrary. What matters is it's the same unit of measure. So that's so we can meet at the same place. We have the same unit of measure, and we have an authoritative clock that sort of specifies time, so we can be at the same. So we're solving a coordination problem, right. And the convention does that. But the problem is we lose track of the fact that that's all it is. And when we talk about the time, we're about being a midlife. Someone has a midlife crisis because they think their life's half over. They're operating within a calendar, and they're making the calendar institution more real than it is, right? So, and we just forget that, right? And that's the kind of thing that I think the Nietzschean idea of eternal recurrence, which he was just sort of exploring. Hey, wait a minute, why can't just every present moment be as real as every other? Right. And then there's just narrative constructs laid over, and then like that's not even necessarily wrong from a physics point of view, right?
Well, no, but I think this is a big problem. And I mean, look, we live in a culture that's heavily informed by a construct of the Enlightenment, right? Yeah. Is that the scientific reality that people tend to view as truth, which has created amazing comfort. It has done, on one level, on one, shallow level, it has really enhanced our world in ways that no other humans on this planet have ever enjoyed. I mean, I'm going to quote Pete Holmes here. We live like pharaohs. I mean, I can go in that refrigerator over there. I can drink, absinthe from France right now. I can pull ice out of that fridge. I can, whatever. You can buy anything from anywhere, at any time, and it's not that hard. Yeah. But at the same time, the problem is people start to think, well, that's everything. This veneer that we exist in is who we are. And to your point about time, how old we are, what old means, what young means. I mean, it's all fairly arbitrary and constructed because it allows us to live these lives that we exist in. So here's curious question here. This is the first pandemic most people who are alive today have lived through. Some older, my dad remembers polio. I don't. It didn't exist when I was a kid. Right. Smallpox. I remember getting a smallpox vaccine at school, but a long time ago. It sort of seems to me like the thin veneer of civilization that we've been existing in that gives us these great comforts, air conditioning, absinthe from France, and all these wonderful things is cracking. And all this, to your point, like this idea that we have to work so hard so we can have all these things that maybe don't really matter that much if you actually break through a little bit, are kind of eroding. You've written a lot about fairness. You've written a lot about assholes. Do you think, and we can, I actually would like to dig into that a little bit. I'm not sure how much time we have, but when you're, and I have all the time in the world, I just don't want to be careful of your time.
I have time, yeah.
When you're thinking about like this pandemic, COVID, and what's happening right now, and you're thinking about the constructs we've created to exist in, that a thing like this really, it's like, I was just rereading Camus' The Plague because I thought it was interesting. Oh, right. Right. So when you start breaking through these veneers of civilization and you start to recognize, well, wait a minute, whether or not I drink Pernod or whether I drink a local whiskey really doesn't matter to me that much. Whether or not, what matters to me are my kids healthy? Is my wife healthy? Are my parents okay? There's a lot of things that really matter. This isn't one of them. What do you think mean, maybe take us through assholes, a theory a little bit, and how COVID might be changing our view of reality, and what civilization or what society or what these
Right.
structures,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
watch what does that mean?
Yeah. Something. Well, I think when there's a connection with that. So I think of assholes as operating with an entrenched sense of entitlement that makes them unable to entertain the complaints of other people. That's the really short version of it.
So it's not just somebody like who's a dick by accident, but it's somebody who's intentionally.
Yeah. So in the first place, it's like
day.
a stable state of the proper asshole is someone who has a stable trait of character. So they're systematically across many areas of social life. They operate with this sense of entitlement and they take special privileges and then will.
No one else matters. They're the only one that matters.
Yeah, and shut down. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So there's like this way in which, but I guess to connect this with the pandemic, I mean, what's interesting about it is that, so that's the case in which there's things that sort of ordinary cooperative people don't think they're entitled to do. The asshole can construct an entitlement for. So that's the kind of makes it look like kind of preposterous. But then the kind of remarkable thing about the pandemic in the advanced world is it kind of shows a way in which the things that we are ordinarily entitled to do, like shake other people's hands, like go wander or go where we want to, be outside when we want to, those things we are normally entitled to do. But then suddenly they're taken away from us for good reasons, but we're really resistant and defensive and kind of, so there's like a transition there for us to sort of gradually relax and sort of adapt. And now most of us did it actually fairly admirably, but like, it doesn't take much. We also have an inner asshole,
Hey, so Rich, a buddy of mine that is a mountain biker, we were talking about another mutual friend who's been very adamant about keeping these rules that we have with the pandemic, and I applaud that. Until he has some really compelling, like, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. What are you guys doing? You can't, da da da. And then he's like, hey, should I go to Palm Springs this weekend? There's this really hot girl, but I haven't really been with her, and we're like, no, dude, you were the one telling us we can't do it. First, he went to Palm Springs, right?
Yeah.
Not surprising because we all have our inner asshole. He doesn't tend to live that way, but we all express it.
I mean, my thing is that this is such a radical shift to our ways of living so quickly. I mean, I think we've all done like kind of really admirably well at it, but it takes a long time to actually figure out what it all means and what's too much and too little. So I actually give a fair amount of slack for even people going to the beach and like, okay, how much distance, too much, like what travels, like
in the lineup. Yeah.
Or even the lineup. Yeah. I mean, so I think
is everyone
there's a way in which we're understandably resistant to change, but then like we're being asked to do a really difficult thing, so I can kind of, so I have a fair amount of grace like that. But the part of us that just gets indignant and rationalizes and comes up with like a lot of bullshit arguments about why we shouldn't have to do X, Y, Z. That's the part that's kind of the inner asshole, and it's if we weren't faced with the risk of death or killing somebody or taking out an old folks home, like it'd be like, like fortunately, I mean, there is that vivid kind of thing that kind of keeps the defensive-ness in check. But I think most people have done it's actually incredible cultural shift. It's really incredible. Like
the vast majority of people in America have actually done a really good job.
Yeah, they have. And we're still figuring out exactly what it means. Like I think that, we're maybe overdoing on some parts of it, but that's gradually emerging. Like in some, like what's really essential and what isn't is hard to figure out as you go. It depends on progress of science. Like how knowing gradually as we figure out how the virus spreads, how well it does airborne versus through droplets.
Yeah.
Like being outside with a little bit of wind apparently makes all the difference. Like it's very difficult to contract it in that case. So like beach isn't as dangerous. A bunch of people being at the beach doing social distancing is much lower risk than if they're inside a grocery store and shopping.
Right.
Like, cause then they're in the same confined space. If there's not an airflow, then the virus can hang for a long time. But if there's a bit of a breeze, then it'll blow away. That stuff
which is actually the opposite of what is Scripps. I mean, this poor woman, she was trying to, put her theories out, and she got badly misquoted, I think, from Scripps. But she was saying, wouldn't go in the ocean for $1 million, and
Oh yeah, right. I read that quote, and I thought about what she said a lot actually.
Yeah.
She was saying the viruses can drift if there's a bit of a breeze, and I thought technically that's true, but I thought it was really unlikely at the time, and it turns out I think it is. It could happen, but. Like when you're doing a whole population, you're doing things that just shift the risk profiles, you need to shift them systematically. And so it's like, what are the most important risks that you need to shift? That's like,
also, who are the people surfing? Probably not the people at risk, right?
Yeah, right. Maybe they don't know if they're symptomatic. So that's tricky. But the thing is, it takes a fair amount of time to figure these things out. And like, so people have different attitudes about it. So I'm pretty slow to call people assholes about that. Like,
no, I didn't mean it that way.
Myself was like, just like, look, I'm a lowers regular and I've been surfing there 30 years, like 20 years every swell, unless I'm traveling, right? So it's like, and that's a fucking public park. That's like, like,
are people at lowers assholes? This is like, I got to ask that.
Well, I saw a certain asshole streak come out, actually. I saw with like a little bit, actually, with like, they started being hostile to like outsiders coming in when that was like the one spot that was kind of open, like Malibu had been closed and lowers, and there was a bit more of an asshole streak that came out that I was kind of surprised by.
Do you think Trestles got closed because of lowers?
I think probably, well, the one thing I really probably, I think the thing I really appreciated, both Crystal Cove, where I go all the time to walk the dog, and Trestles, it's at both state parks. So they were very slow to close it down. And they even did it in a staged way. So I really respected, they were very reluctant to actually they didn't rush to like quick measures.
You can still surf Sammy's though. You can still surf Crystal Cove.
Oh yeah, you can?
Yeah.
I know you just, no, they just blocked parking. Yeah. No, that's right.
Yeah.
No, at Crystal Cove, so they were really reluctant to close the whole thing down, but they closed down the parking, hoping that would help. And Trestles, they tried to do that first, and then it didn't work. Right. And what I read was they said the surfers weren't doing that good job of social distancing, probably because of lowers. And then they also said they didn't want to have too big of a contrast with San Diego, which had taken a more.
So
they wanted more consistency there. So I thought.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So I'm like, to me, that's when the like pandemic became an existential issue. I'm like, what? I can't go lower. It's like, what the fuck? So to me, I'm like, wait, okay, I don't mind being dead, but if I'm alive, I can't go. What do you mean I can't go to lowers? Like, like.
there are other spots on the coast. I'm happy to show you.
No, I know. I surfed Newport this morning.
So did I. Okay.
This morning, but later afternoon. But yeah. Yeah.
So here's a question. So let's talk a little bit about the Reddit article. I thought that was really interesting. There's this Reddit forum called "Am I the Asshole?"
Yeah.
And I think you've been paying attention to it, and you were quoted about it in Fast Company.
Yeah, so that interview, I read the occasional blurb from it, but I haven't followed it. But the kind of thing I thought that was kind of interesting about it is, well, when I worked on the book, it's like the thing, if you're trying to give a philosophical characterization of something and define something like the asshole, so that you think, oh yeah, that's a real concept, you got to focus on the paradigm cases. So the really clear cut.
Right.
So the really clear-cut case. So I had a couple surfing examples and an academic. So those are like three people I thought those are bona fide assholes, proper assholes as I call them.
Proper.
And, yeah. And so I tailor the definition to fit those guys, right? And then actually I had this definition for a while, and it wasn't until I started working on the book and my agent was telling me, no, you got to apply it to politics. And I was like, oh, those are hard cases, what philosophers call it. They're difficult and diverse.
So Trump, right?
Oh yeah, Trump was definitely, he early on, before in 2012, he still fit. So what I did was come up with a taxonomy of different asshole types. And then I thought, I'm going to go with clear-cut cases and then just put them in categorize, like this is like Aristotelian kind of ecology of the asshole system, ecosystem, kind of. So, and then, and Trump was in there. And actually what I said about him, when I look back at it, it wasn't wrong. It fit. It was before he went into politics and stuff. But now all kinds of new stuff has come out. But that was like something I did fairly reluctantly,
How did you pick Donald Trump? I mean,
I was just looking at anyone. I thought I would talk to people and I would think, who do you think of? And then they had to be public figures. And then you also have to find like really clear contextual evidence. Like, so like something like, well, that evidence like is already pretty decisive evidence right there. Like those actions, those comments, because it can't just be genuine like innuendo or insinuation or just like.
It's like somebody's actually making statements saying no one else matters. I'm the only one that matters. It's very, I mean, I'm putting words in your mouth so you can correct this, but
not exactly.
Like authenticity and self above community. Is it those types of?
Those kinds of things would help. I mean, those wouldn't be enough by themselves maybe, but like, so you want a contextual detail that really kind of fit them in either the general theory or the type that I was looking for, right? So that's what I was looking for. And it was like not that hard to find, actually. I mean, I left a lot of people out, like, oh, they're borderline, or I don't really have good evidence, so I'm not just going to do name calling. So it was like, but then there's still like plenty. There's 2 chapters in that book, and it's just all these types, right? And going through history and then contemporary. So there's plenty of that, but you're leaving out a lot of like gray areas. So to get back to the blog, the Reddit thing, there's all this gray area. There's like half-ass assholes. There's like someone's having a bad week. They have a bad asshole year. There's teenagers are going through an asshole phase, like a lot of teenagers do.
Accidental assholes.
Yeah, right. So you're taking out all that kind of gray area that, a way that we can really, one thing that's interesting about the asshole as opposed to the psychopath who sort of seems beyond the pale and hard to understand is like, you can kind of understand the asshole because you're like, yeah, but there by the grace of God go I, I have an inner asshole. I can get into that mode of thought, like rationalizing, defensive and entitled and da-da-da. Maybe I'm like that with an argument with, with a spouse or like with a cop or like,
yeah. Well, no, there was a really good article in Slate about your asshole book by Alex, what's his name? Alex
Balk.
Yeah, and a part of his article, he was talking about you and another book about assholes. And part of what he did is he reflected on himself and said, like, here's my inner asshole. And by the way, we all have it. And I think that was really helpful because it's easy to point the finger at somebody else being an asshole and, what's got two thumbs in is an asshole.
Right. So I think if you worry about whether you're an asshole, that's a good sign that you're not one, but it's still a really important sort of check for a cooperative person to like actually worry about that, but so that's what I think the Reddit blog, which is kind of refreshing. There's nothing clean about it from a philosophical point of view. It's like all these really messy examples. People are writing all this detail about this dispute or this incident that happened. And then it's kind of like, some of them are pretty delicate issues. You don't just say asshole, not asshole, like I wouldn't, if I were writing like a response to that, I'd write like a more kind of careful ethics, it'd be like, well, there's this argument, there's this, like a more nuanced kind of thing. But why is it kind of interesting for people to either write or view or comment on these like kind of blog posts with like very specific detail? And I thought it's kind of interesting because there's both a confessional mode. So there's people who are kind of confessing. They're kind of, maybe some of them want absolution, like they feel like they really are an asshole, but then they want to get told they're not. So if they're worried about it, then that's a sign that maybe they're not so much an asshole. And then there's the other side of people wanting to like criticize and condemn people for doing something this, and that's like maybe wanting a little bit of asshole justice when it seems like there's not very much of it lately, when assholes seem to get away with everything. Like, how is there going to be some accountability at some point? Well, now we've got the blog seems to like maybe offer a little bit of that, like someone doing an asshole thing who's going to like, they're going to get told the right thing, and they're kind of,
it's kind of like Dear Ann, right? It's like the Dear Ann Landers column, but in a modern way. Like, I mean, people used to write Ann Landers going, hey, this is the conundrum, what do you think? And it's
right. Same with Anthony Appiah, who is a good philosopher, and he was doing a thing in the New Yorker, is it the New York Times Magazine? Had a column for a while, an ethics column, people writing with these conundrums, and he would sort of tease through it and kind of thing. And I used to thought, oh man, I would never take that job, because it's hard to say things decisive about, like, especially in a very short space. You're kind of like,
yeah, you can't wait.
I mean, I would do it with a friend. You could really talk it all through and like maybe get somewhere, but like just a short thing, like doing something that like is faithful to the person's circumstances. And like, it's like
600 words. Yeah.
Yeah. It's such a hard thing to do. So like, and like steer clear of that kind of judgments about people in the asshole book, right? Cause like understanding there's plenty to say, there are plenty of proper assholes, so you don't need to like get into the murky. But then that AMA thing, the Reddit post is kind of it shows that there's a kind of appetite for like getting into that kind of complexity.
Yeah.
In a good way.
It also showed, I think the article talked about the fact that particularly now when it seems like, for example, President of the United States keeps getting away with constant lying, just all kinds of silly things and things not that silly, that people are seeking a form for justice of some version, even if there's no strings attached, like impeachment.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of people, maybe it gives them a sense of, we've decided, even if we can't execute justice in this sense.
Yeah, no, it's in some ways it's reassuring and restore the accountability. If people feel like there's a little bit of accountability or there's a little bit of open discussion about it, then you might feel like, okay, it's not just that the signal is be an asshole, you can get away with it, like this is the new way of doing things, but more like, no, not everybody is. Like for the most part, like still even people who've done something that's pretty questionable, they're still seeking accountability, can be held to account. Like, and people are sort of more decent than you might have others thought if you just were watching the news, you know, or you had whatever tribalistic lens you're looking at on, you know, like taking off the kind of conventional political framing of things, you know, and then just kind of, it can in a way restore your faith in people's willingness to be cooperative and mutual respectful by seeing that kind of discussion. But yeah, that was my thought.
So early in my career, I did a lot of political work. I'm a huge fan of Edmund Burke and applying philosophy to political life. And so I did a lot of work in term limits, worked in a couple think tanks and for a congressman, but the real meaningful work I did was in term limits, where we're trying to reform this idea of how, you know, kind of making a systemic change rather than just changing a person or a little public policy change. And we passed a lot of term limit laws in 23 states. And I was responsible for the 17 Western states for getting on the ballots and managing those drives. And then I ran the voter education for Americans for term limits, which was basically all of our advertising. And the interesting thing is everywhere, you know, so we're trying to throw legislators out of office. So as you can imagine, everywhere we got on the ballot, we got sued. And so we had a big string of attorneys helping us with, you know, cases in 23 states and federal cases. We went to the Supreme Court. One of the things that we established was that when we were hiring all these strings of attorneys, we really wanted attorneys with what we called a low AQ, a low asshole quotient.
Oh, okay.
Because it's hard to manage assholes.
Yeah.
You know, they're very self-focused. They don't gel well in an enterprise or in a vision. So I was kind of thinking through some of that. And I was thinking about, you know, okay, so you think about AQ, you're thinking about political leadership. Can you apply this kind of asshole quotient or your asshole theory, assholes theory to, I know presidential politics has been popular. Maybe this isn't a fair question, but I think it might be interesting at least to think about. Sometimes I do speed rounds where it's just binary questions, which are also totally unfair, but they're just fun to do. So if you were going to apply your asshole quotient to, let's say, Obama, Clinton, Trump, Biden, Sanders, how would you apply it to each of those presidential, either former presidents or?
How do I apply? Yeah. Well, quickly, I was going to make one point about that you were making just before I go to the people. But one, I think you're right that it's about the incentives and the structure of the incentives that are really, really crucial. Like it's not just a surprise if there's suddenly a lot more assholes in politics, right? It's like you've got a system that's like creating incentives for those kinds of people, or for people that even don't start up with assholes. That was Milton Friedman.
We took that. Milton Friedman worked with us back when he was still alive.
Yeah.
He did this whole thing where he said, look, the problem is that especially in the federal U.S. House of Representatives, if you're running for re-election every 2 years, you're constantly raising money for re-election.
Right.
And if you have to constantly run for re-election, that means you have to constantly raise money. If you have to constantly raise money, you have to trade something for that money. What do you think you're trading? You're trading lines of tax code primarily.
Right.
And so, you know, our tax code is millions and millions of lines of tax code. Nobody really knows what's in it, and it constantly changes every year. And the fundamental reason for that is because if you're not raising $25,000 a day on average in the U.S. House of Representatives, you will not get reelected, and you got to sell something at $25K every day.
Yeah, right. And now I've tried to read the tax code, and it's freaking impossible. But even though I'd like do
you might read it this year, but you won't know what it is next year.
No, absolutely, yeah. No, right. But that's a bit of a side point. But I think the incentives, especially now, like in the social media age, where power is connected with who's getting the most attention, you know, it's getting eyeballs that's really crucial. And there's a much more looser media structure without sort of conventional sort of filters on that. Now the incentives are just sort of what like keeps attention, what reinforces your base, pleases the base support, you know, kind of, and then like in a fairly, well, where you can win elections on close margins, you know, then it's like driving turnout as opposed to like, you know, winning over like a large number of people. It's winning on the margin. So, I mean, there's all these incentives built into the system that have made it like, well, to pick, the first point is just, it's the incentives that really matter that create a kind of
It's a heavily gamified process too, right?
Yeah,
You have
right. So like,
all kinds of things.
and the incentives are all out of whack, and that's why we have, and the structures are all out of whack, and that's why we have so many assholes. But Trump, I think, for example, reflects as much. I mean, he's a bona fide asshole, like a world-class asshole. I mean, like,
not a surprise.
well, he's like the most exemplary. He's like literally the best con man in the history of the world. Like in all of the world, he's the absolute best con man. I mean, there's just no one even close to nearly as good as him. And he's also like an incredible like asshole. And I think that's why his supporters, they like him for that reason. That's part of the idea of why he's going to, you know, shake up like corrupt politics. That was the thought. So I don't think it's totally controversial to think even that he's an asshole per se, but I think that he's a reflection of the really distorted structures and cultures and media environment that we already have. So it's sort of like in some sense we've got the asshole we deserve. Like, you know. Like,
no, I totally agree. I mean, look, when we have, I totally agree with you. Look, we elected a reality TV star. What do we expect, right? And I think to your point, like, one, he reflects politics is a reaction. It doesn't lead culture, it reacts to culture, right? So we got what we deserve. We created the culture. This is what we deserve from it. I think the second point to that is, what's funny to me is people I deeply respect who become massive Trump like defenders. My father, I love him.
Mm-hmm. Mine too, recently passed away, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, went to Johns Hopkins, physician, surgeon, elder in our church, president of the school board. If I said one of the things that Donald Trump said, I would have gotten slapped growing up. If I behaved that way, I don't know how many times I would have been ostracized. But somehow, you know, and it turns these wonderful, magnificent people, in my mind, at least to me, you know, maybe other people disagree with this, but it turns them into assholes defending this asshole. It's like you have to embrace the asshole to defend the asshole, which basically, correct me if help me apply this theory. Doesn't that make you an asshole as well?
Yeah, no, I don't think it does actually, but
okay, fair enough.
I don't think it does. And but it's a really important, a super important question about what it reflects about our society that so many people are willing to defend and enable what he's doing. Like, so there's a whole bunch of factors that are part of the backdrop for that. I mean, maybe the most important one is just the massive decline of trust in institutions. But then the big thing that gets revealed aside from that is that the kind of implicitly authoritarian idea of how social order and political order should work. And there's a pretty big division, I think, among people, often who have good people. A lot of my friends, especially the surfing, but then family, like that's their default, right? So their idea of how order and civilization happens is you have a hierarchy, you know, of a certain kind. And it turns out that like that's the older way of doing things before democracy and the idea of a republic and republicanism came on the scene. You know, there was the Roman, you know, experiment with that, but then later it was like with you know, Rousseau and the American Revolution. You know, that was when the new idea of a republic got it going, and that was a break from the more authoritarian style of politics. Now, it was a huge achievement to sort of overcome that, but in some sense, the kind of more authoritarian or tribal kind of idea of politics, in-group, out-group, with hierarchies, that's sort of baked pretty deeply into human social structure.
We tend to revert to that every time the higher forms, or I would consider it a higher form, you know, the higher freedoms fall apart, you always end up.
Yeah, right. So then when the trust required for these other like democratic Republican institutions required, people default back to that, but they do it to different degrees, right? So, and that's what I think you see with people like who like don't say anything. And then there's within a tribalistic idea, it's fine for the person who can work their way to the top of the hierarchy to be an asshole as long as he's doing he's providing order. Like discipline, order. He's putting other
asshole. Right.
Yeah, that's because he's an asshole that he's keeping other assholes in line. Right? He's the super asshole. That's a Hobbes idea, by the way. Is just the strong man overalls of the others, and that's why they cooperate. And you saw that even like with Chris Christie. Like remember when he was running for president? He was like a big asshole, New Jersey governor. You know, but then with so this contest with Trump versus all these other assholes kind of came down. And it was clear that Chris Christie was the sub, right? You know, and then like there's this classic scene where he was like, started kissing Trump's ass, and he was just like sort of serenely compliant and, you know, just totally submissive like a lapdog. And it was like, wow, what a remarkable thing. So that's
it's definitely a pack mentality. Well, and if you look at like, I mean, even off the U.S., if you look at Iraq, right? I mean, Bush 1 really understood well was, you know, they were like, why didn't you take down Baghdad? And James Baker under Bush too, when he was kind of doing the wrap up on why we had fucked up in Iraq so badly, he goes, no one's asking me why we didn't take down Baghdad anymore. And the point was, you know, if you don't have the fabric to support freedom and liberty and these higher ideas, you better have a big asshole in there to keep all the other assholes under control. Because if you take that lid off the pot, it's going to be an asshole explosion. And nobody wants
Or they reversion to tribalism and
yeah,
you know, and
kill everybody.
all the older, which is what happened. Yeah. And it's still, I mean, now, and I've been surprised as anyone to see America kind of revert to tribalism, more authoritative kinds of thinking as anyone. But looking back, it's like, this was always baked into American, like it's always reemerged. So it's always been a struggle. And then, this is another thing I wanted to say in connection with the pandemic. So in Indonesia, which is a relatively new democracy, right? It's very proud of being democratic, right? But the way politics works, like sort of at the concrete level, is by the local tribes and villages, and that's pretty tribalistic and authoritarian in the structure, right? And men rule and everything like that. And you see that when you're there a lot, because what's nice about being with a kind of loosey-goosey system that's not super strict about rules is like you're less likely to be arbitrarily treated because somebody's applying rules. But on the other hand, if you go on the wrong side of the bosses, if you get on the wrong side of like generally really nice people, then you can get in like really fucking big trouble like fast, right? So we can't count on the law to bail you out. I mean, like there's not gonna be laws to like screw you over, but if you get on the wrong side of the people enforcing like a law against you, then so it's much more like dealing with personalities and local relationships. And so, you know, so that's...
We go to Sumba. Have you been to Sumba, like Nihiwatu or any of those places?
No, I usually go north, yeah.
So this, you know, it's, I love Sumatra. I've been to Batu Islands. I haven't been to Nias, been to Batu, Mentawais, et cetera, Mentawai. Yeah. But Sumba, you know, it's this big island, not that many people, very tribalistic, very Iron Age still, one of the more remote parts of Indonesia. I mean, they still practice headhunting.
Oh, wow.
And when, you know, when Claude started Nihiwatu, this great resort, I mean, he had to trade water buffalo. I mean, they don't even use money anymore. And, you know, the way you get a spouse is you go to a neighboring tribe, you steal a woman. If you steal her, you get to keep her. If they catch you, they cut your head off. And to your point, like, once she's in the tribe, man, she's one of the tribe.
Right. Okay.
If you don't get her in the tribe, you lose, and
you die. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You die, but that's kind of the history of the world until the last few hundred years.
That's right. Yeah. So I think and then so now now we're seeing much more of that a resurgence of that in a really big way that is sort of, there's always been these tensions running through American history and they take different forms. But so the interesting thing about the pandemic is that, so I partly I love, like I go for a month usually to Indo, and it's just, as you know, from being out, like just to get your head out of the advanced world headspace, which is like so screwed up in so many ways. And you just like, and part of it is that it's like life in Indo is more like pandemic life here, because you're aware of existential risk all the time. I mean, it's like, okay, it's malaria here now, or it's earthquakes or volcanoes or ferry accidents, or, you know,
the earthquake route. I mean, in Nias, you know, the earthquake route from the hut you're staying in up whatever hill you need to run if those earthquake sirens go off.
Oh yeah, I have like nightmares about that. And like, I'm in bed, like I'm waking up and I'm already imagining like trying to find the phone and the shoes to just beeline up that hill.
And there's sea vipers and every other fucking animal trying to go with you.
And the tsunamis and and how is this going to work out in the disaster zone? And like, so those are like real, those are all real. And then like, and part of me just like loves going there and being, because it's not so dangerous immediately. You can manage the risks, but the risks are salient, right? And it like really changes your perspective on life, because like your plans are held much more tentatively, and you're just more present. And then life is beautiful. Like there's like incredible waves, and it's beautiful, and there's wonderful people, and there's like great sense of community, and there's all the kids everywhere, and da. So it's like,
and you life is really rich. Happen. Right, you're just letting it happen. You can't control the tides. You can't control the swell. You just make things. You know, you make it up along. Yeah. And
you're still in this kind of special position because you also have money and you have a passport and you can leave anytime, and like you can go to a hospital in Singapore if you really need to and be there. You know, so it's like you can't necessarily get a helicopter if you get hurt, if you hit the reef and break your neck, because the helicopters don't fly. You know, like where, you know.
Yeah. I
heard a story about a guy who was like a really rich guy who like hired a boat like with a bunch of friends, and he got really hurt and he was trying to get a helicopter out. It might have been the Mentawais or maybe Banyaks. And then, but he's making a call trying to get a helicopter, and he's saying, you know, I'll pay you $1 million, $1 million for a helicopter. And then the guy's just like, sorry, sir, helicopter don't go there. Like, $1 million. No, $1 million. I am rich man. $1 million. Sorry, sir, helicopter don't go there. No, $1 million. Sorry, sir, helicopter don't go there. And he means that there's no helicopter.
Doesn't exist here, man. It's a different world.
Sorry, you have to get on the boat. Take a boat. Like.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's like as a surfer and like surfers who go there know this. So I love doing that because I feel like I'm really resetting a lot of the illusions and delusions that we live in here in the rich world. It probably comes because we've effectively managed the risks really well. But we've then forgotten about pandemics or forgotten about what we have to actually do to prevent them, right? So I don't know, we forgot them, but there were some massive failures of it. But like, this isn't like so unusual in the history of the world, right? It's only the success of good institutions and good government that they became much less common, that we could go 100 years without a large scale.
We just don't remember it.
But if you go to world history stuff, like guns, germs, and steel, like all the, like one of the main drivers of civilization has been germs and pandemics and for rise and fall of civilizations. So that's one of the big along with technology of all kinds of sorts and cultural shifts and tribal political, so germs, pandemics, it's just the big thing. So we've gradually tamed those things in the rich world, but then generally lost a sense of there's a lot of people in government who really haven't lost the sense and they know the risks and they were really giving warnings and trying to do things about it. But as a general culture, we've lost the sense that that's a real, we just take for granted. We feel entitled to our normal freedoms to go, interact with people and work however we want and go to the beach. And
what do you mean I can go to the beach?
Go entitled. We feel entitled. We are normally entitled to do those things. That's all a beautiful achievement. But it's much more fragile than than we assume. And even for me, I'm deliberately going to Indo every year for a month to sort of destabilize my sense of what's an accomplishment in the advanced world versus what's sort of the human condition.
Yeah.
I deliberately destabilize, but I still had always thought, well, okay, there's developing world and there's the advanced world where we have these things sorted out, but we have to remind ourselves of fragility. And it's like, no, we don't actually have it fucking sorted out. We don't really. And that's true both on the pandemic management, these are related, and the politics, like democracy, republicanism.
It's still an experiment. Yeah.
Still in flux. And in the end, the US looks much more like Indo now than I would have said a year ago, or 2 years ago, both because of the political shifts and because of the pandemic. And those are related, by the way, because it's the authoritarian style of politics that's not very good at anticipate. With China, this is why they screwed up the pandemic. They don't want news to get out, so they suppress the information. And then they can't do the aggressive stuff. They can't mobilize support for it. Same thing with Trump, worried about the score, the numbers. So he suppresses the stuff. He got warnings from WHO. South Korea had the first case the same day we did. They could have done all the aggressive action stuff, but the incentives about looking bad for the more authoritarian types of thinking, don't lend themselves to precautionary action. The pandemic for me has been just learning a lot about. Well, it was sort of Sumatra came to me this year, kind of because I was going there for the destabilized things, but now the existential risk, oh yeah, okay, well this is much more like life, like in Indo. We're just totally not used to doing it, okay, but this is what life is like for most people, for most times, in human history. So in some sense, I think it's a really valuable reminder about the fragility of civilization, of all of our really good accomplishments, about what it takes to keep them.
Well, I think, to that point, particularly travel to places where we're not comfortable. We're not just staying in a Western hotel, where we're actually living in culture and a different society, a foreign society from where we're from. It shows us a lot about ourselves, right? Hopefully part of the reason people travel, and I've been doing it for most of my life now, since I was, young, you think you're discovering something else, but really it's kind of a reflection of who you are as you kind of immerse yourself in it. And the thing, I've had breakdowns at different times as I've thought I'd build something up, and then, it's unsustainable, and whether it's internally or whether it's some external structure that breaks. the thing for me, and I think this is where you're going with the Indonesian conversation, is the thing for me that I've discovered is that usually, when we're seeking deep joy and happiness, happiness is always the illusion. Deep joy is what we're actually probably looking for. And, we think we're going to, I always say, be careful what you wish for, because you might get it. As you build these things, they can be amazing. They can be wonderful. It can give you all of your heart's desires until you realize maybe that's not really what I want. And I think it was either this last year or the year before, it may have been I can't remember now. It was either last year or the year before. I went to the islands. It's kind of in the North Aceh area, the Bandu Islands, I think, or Batu Island. And I stayed at this very off the beaten path resort that, you're staying in basically a woven grass hut. There were water buffalo. In the morning when I'd get up, there were water buffalo in the little creek that came out into the ocean right next to my hut. And, there weren't very many people around. And and you'd go out and surf this perfect little A-frame right in front of this little, very old school resort, very, very, no AC, no hot water, very, very simple. And I was reading a book about meditation. So I was meditating, didn't have AC, didn't have ice, didn't have the normal amenities. It was one of the most refreshing times of my life. In fact, I can't wait to get back to a place like that. I've been on glamorous boat trips with Quicksilver. My wife and I've stayed at Four Seasons in the Maldives and surfed a lot of great spots. And that's wonderful too in its own way. Nihiwatu is fantastic. But I think to your point, like when you peel everything away, and we're very privileged. I mean, we don't have to live there forever. We go there, we experience it, and we leave. But I think that, the beauty of all that is it brings you back, especially if you take the time to dig into it. And you're saying you're taking a month there, and you're really getting into the pace of the culture. You're breathing it in, you're living it. It just transforms your idea of what reality really is.
Yeah, no, that to me, that's really, because when you're there, if you're there for a long time, you realize that you can be just totally happy with a lot less, and just by being present, maybe you're still waiting for waves, kind of like, or hoping for the next swell, or kind of like but if it's just been a bunch of good swells, maybe you're pretty content, and you're like, kind of like, I actually do get tired of getting tubed there occasionally.
Give me a big open face, man. I want to do a turn. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, you can just be really happy with so much less. And then when I'm there, I'm really absorbed. The way I think about my life here is I think about, man, the shit I'm preoccupied with, like in terms of like just academic, like the status markers and the stresses, stuff like, I just don't give a shit about any of that. Like I love my life here, and I feel really, really fortunate to have like the life and career I have. But like there's a kind of seriousness with which you can kind of take it, which you don't have to take. And and that's what you experience when you're there. And of course, it's not the same as just being there forever and not being able to leave, and having to worry about easily preventable diseases and stuff like that, because you wouldn't have the money to or you wouldn't have access to a hospital or doctors who you could even trust, to deal with it. So it's like, there's that kind of stuff. But yeah, so I deliberately, I've gone to lots of places in Indo, but I deliberately try to stay at not go to the resorts as much as to just stay like in poorer,
homestay. Yeah.
Well, yeah, more homestay style, and be closer to people and community, and it's cheaper, but not that I can't afford more. I do pay more often, but just to deliberately,
it's the authentic experience, right? You actually feel like you.
Yeah, and still on the other hand, there are like people that are catering to you constantly, like making all your food and like performing all these services. So you're still like living pretty well in an unusual kind of way, because you can pay for those services. And there's like a surf infrastructure that kind of develops with like enough like locals that have grown up and figure out how to solve the surfer needs and problems, like quickly, and like pay, so you can pay for stuff, to have it happen. So it's like, it's sort of convenient still in that way, in which like just like a life of poverty wouldn't be, or like,
or like you were saying in the 70s, like Ian told me when he first went to Uluwatu, they slept in the cave.
Yeah.
There were no warongs. There was no
Yeah,
Radisson Blu.
when I first went there, there was just like these bamboo like places for like massages and stuff. It was so beautiful. First time I went there, it was like, I was shocked when I went back and saw the favela
The
that now exists.
concrete, yeah, the concrete jungle.
I was so shocked. I mean, it's fortunately still a really fun wave, but
Yeah.
like when you just look at the mess that's on there, it's like, oh Lord.
Single fin
Yeah,
bar.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, it's such a mess. But it's kind of, well, so actually at some point I'm going to write an autobiography about my time in Indo, and like a philosophical, telling stories and with philosophical upshot. And then like one of the kind of things I will hopefully draw out is like, there's this way that Indonesians are trying to become like us, trying to become advanced, right? Like they're embracing sort of, business and more capitalistic ways of thinking, and they're trying to develop, and they're not worried about environmental conservation so much, because they're trying to, like I'll have arguing with the local guy who I stay with all the time about like, they're just cutting down trees. And I'm like, what are you doing? You don't want to cut down trees like that. Like it's hard to have that argument in Sumatra when it's just like chock-a-block, just trees everywhere. It's like,
Well, and it's, it's how they, the amount of money they earn from a tree is
yep.
fundamentally different than other things.
So the economics environment trade-off is really different, even though like the center of Sumatra is being deforested at a massive rate and a huge climate problem.
Yeah.
So for like, you have to make it economically viable for them not to cut down the trees. Right. So, but even just like just from the ideas point of view, with a local guy, I'll argue like, he don't cut down the tree. You're like, look, you don't want to do that. This is what we did in America, is we and then we had to go and try to fix it all afterwards. And it's much harder to do that than just to like develop well. Yeah. And then, it's like, I'm saying like, you should learn from our mistakes. And then Damien, the local guy, he's like, no, if it was good enough for you, it's good enough for us. I'm like, no.
They all want the idea of America,
right,
the reality of America. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then they get some of the like benefits of all the gadgets and stuff, like great phones. And now like Damien, the local guy, like he'll Skype me. We'll do like Facebook FaceTime or Messenger, video. Like when I first started going there, you couldn't get an internet access very easily. There now, like I'm video conferencing with him, like on his cell phone. So it's like,
I have a buddy Katut, strangely named, in Bali, who was just messaging me on WhatsApp the other day, literally 2 days ago, saying, "Are you okay? I heard there's a lot of deaths in the United States from COVID." I was like, "No, we're good. Thank you for." But I think there's that connection. They can reach out that easily versus when I first went and lived in Japan in the early 1990s. I mean, there was one payphone, and I rarely called home.
Yeah, right. So there's this idea, like there's a way in which like they're trying to become advanced, developing countries are trying to become advanced, trying to become rich. And then some of them are doing that really quickly, others a little bit more slowly. But then in the rich world, there's a lot that we need to learn about how to live more like they live, right? It's more present, more about community, and more about life, and more like understanding about luck, because like there in Indo, they have this beautiful attitude towards luck. Bad luck is just something that happens to everybody at different times.
Right.
It's like, it's not like here, but it's like, oh, well, why didn't you create your own luck? Like, what mistake did you make that you're not lucky? Kind of like here we'll blame, like we're going to find somebody to blame, hold responsible for sort of every bad thing that happened. And involves this myth of control, not appreciating the fragility of our achievements, right? And so the pandemic just blows all that out in a kind of really good way, and makes us help us, like the sensibility that emerges, like anybody can get sick, anybody can die, anybody, like nobody's, even the like famous people, very rich people, political leaders like Boris Johnson, anybody can get.
Tom Hanks got it, man.
Tom Hanks. That was the first one where people were like, wait a minute, okay. Like even the most protected people sort of that have ever lived can get this thing. So it had a kind of, I think it kind of made us much more attuned to our real human vulnerability and interconnection in a really good way. That's the thing you experience, and you feel that when you're in Indo, like you're much more aware of that more palpably. And it's a really valuable thing because you're just much more aware of what's important in life, and it keeps you much more attuned to your own values and able to like, avoid misconceptions about what's important, like the ones that you normally live in, you can see them, for what they are and stuff like that. So I think we're having that experience here, and it was as much a surprise to me, even if I tried pretty actively tried to kind of correct like the misconceptions of advanced world living by going every year, other trips too, I travel a lot and like pretty actively trying to route that out. But then I still learned things going through the pandemic experience, to sort of throw off our like even more illusions than I thought we had. So in that way, I think it's been pretty remarkable. Yeah.
Do you think there's a way that this philosophy of attunement, of kind of being aware in the moment, being present in the moment, learning from, these thousands of hours of work in our lives, is there a way that helps us break through barriers in our lives?
Yeah, let's see, I think, well, maybe one thing to say is that what it is to break through barriers, certain kinds of barriers, is to be more attuned to what matters, to the present, to yourself. And that can involve being more critically aware of what takes you out of attunement, sort of like messages from their culture or expectations or misconceptions about life that are kind of throwing you out of whack. And so in some sense, reflection or travel is a good way of like, just without, a kind of non-intellectual, you're just faced with these contrasts, right? And then you find yourself able to live through them and you're like, oh, hey, okay.
Reality shifts in a way.
Yeah, right. So like travel does that, but you can do that through just reflection and intellectual contemplation as well. And so there's like I say, there's a kind of back and forth, I think, like a lot of the times our blocks, ways that we feel sort of out of attunement, what is to overcome that, to be more attuned, is to let go of misconceptions or, so in some ways our thinking about our life is what's blocking us. And then greater attunement is overcoming the bad thinking, either with better thinking or with just better, more attuned, direct living. But then on the other hand, our ways of thinking, are what sort of help us become more attuned in what's valuable too. Like, so like it's sort of a dynamic back and forth. I don't know if there's a recipe, but attunement is sort of the goal, I guess, is a way of characterizing the goal. Like, so if truth is a property of belief and you think I care about what's true, I want to have knowledge, understanding, that's an intellectual achievement. But then when you know how to do something, there's not a truth, but there is success in action. And like, there's success in living, like, or understanding the meaning of life is something like a kind of success.
Right.
It's not necessarily grasping a set of truths, right? But the two to go together in an attuned life. So it's like your life and your habit and your practice and your routines align with your views about things and your values and the way you conceptualize things, the way you understand and explain things. Like there's just like those are aligned sort of and working together to keep you attuned. That's the way I would think of the ideal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the criticism of some philosophy, right? I mean, there's analytic philosophy, which can be really helpful if you're trying to write code or create an analysis of a situation, particularly in the stock market. That's where people reap big rewards from analytic philosophy. But the problem is you can manufacture a lot of false truths too. You can make almost anything true in that world, which is where it's been, I think, dissatisfying for a lot of philosophers.
Right, or you just get preoccupied with things that don't matter that much because of. So like the great thing about the analytic philosophy is like creating the analytic structure helps you focus and articulate and clarify things that you otherwise wouldn't and can't, right? And you genuinely do see and understand things that you wouldn't. Like if you just do pure continental philosophy, which isn't as rigorous and demanding, there's kind of things you can kind of get a feel for impressionistically, but you can't ever really articulate because you're not really forced to really talk about it in a kind of clear and rigorous way. But then the upside, if you just completely socialized into doing analytic philosophy of methods, and if you're sort of, especially if you get professional incentives, like you're trying to like not just please your like PhD advisors, but then please the profession, and then get tenure, and then keep up your reputation, and then you're attached to certain methods, you've carved out a niche, and there's a way that you can, you've sort of made a career and life for yourself, and like you can really just like become, and hyper specialization is a big problem within academics. So
sure.
So there's a way in which like the way that the methods have value, kind of gamifying thought in a certain way, right? So like to help you focus and help you learn and value certain things, but then they then there's a lot of bigger things that you then lose track of, sort of you're less attuned to. And that's the kind of thing that when people read, like start reading philosophy when they're young, or they resonate with when they read continental thought or the existentialist stuff, that's the stuff it's like, oh, wow, I feel this really relates. I mean, like, I feel like I understand or I appreciate my world or my life in a different light or kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing you can gradually lose if you just do like pure analytic philosophy.
This was kind of my experience. So like, like when I was studying philosophy at Wheaton, I got straight A's in logic, did well in history of philosophy, great. We had this young philosopher at the time, Bruce Benson, who had studied with Gadmer. He got his PhD in the phenomenology of the jazz piano. And so you're doing this like very analytical, rigorous work. And it's, you can be good at that. And I did very well at that. But when Bruce Benson came in and started talking to us about phenomenology and kind of this feeling, this essence, this more, I don't know, metaphysics, not really the right word because it's very existential, but this, this kind of less tangible or less kind of constructed theory, it seemed to have so much more depth and meaning and power in your life. And which is why, one of my favorite philosophers is Camus, not because I think he's the greatest rigorous thinker. It's just the most interesting to read for me.
His literary gifts are what, like make him like just resonate as a writer.
Better as a literature. Yeah. But I think so there's a point where, right, your emotion connects to your rational abilities. And that, to me, that's where a lot of the deep power comes from. It's the applied theory.
So what I think about it, just a little bit of philosophical term, but the analytic methods are getting you towards propositional knowledge and understanding.
Right.
And there's something that philosophers call non-propositional awareness or understanding or perception. And that's the kind of thing that, like just seeing something, right? Like there's whole debates about perception, like, but like seeing a cup on the table, there's a lot of the content of that experience can't be captured in concepts and propositions that could be written down as truths or expressed as truths, or a photo, or something like that. So, and a lot of experience and a sense of our bodies and our presence in the world, our sense of connection to people and our environment. I think of all of that as a non-propositional kind of awareness, and putting things into sort of truth valuable terms, thoughts, or things you can write down as a sentence, that's true in a book that could be, that you could work logical operations on. That's a really small part, as it were, of, you can get at a lot, but it's inherently just not all of, and this is a hotly debated like issue, but just a lot of reality, a lot of human experience comes to us non-propositionally, and we can understand it in propositional, we can get at it in various respects with propositional thought. But then there's sort of deep limitations on that. So, so I think of it, it's kind of like,
it's different tool sets, right? You have an enlightenment tool set, effectively. You have an analytical tool set. They're very helpful. They give you great comfort. You can,
the
light in our home, and the fact that I can get this here is because of enlightenment.
And this is the best way. Like take Heidegger, for example, who's like a notoriously obscure, German continental philosopher. And like, if you're an analytic philosopher, this is going back to the logical positivist. It's like, it's easy and fun to take pot shots at Heidegger because it's like so difficult. Here's a line from Heidegger. Nothing itself noths. Nothing noths. Nothing noths.
Yeah. In the history of philosophy, when you're like outlining Kant, you think, man, can it get harder than this? And then you get to the phenomenologists, and Heidegger in particular, he's creating his own lexicon of language.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Phenomenology, but also, I wouldn't say that they're not primarily focused on trying to be great communicators. They're trying to just get these ideas that they're processing into words onto paper, and the limitations of language just don't allow them to express the phenomenon.
Yeah, that's a version of the point I was going to make. So it's like, it's pretty easy to poke fun at Heidegger for saying almost unintelligible things, but the way I came to appreciate Heidegger as a philosopher of a sort, of what he was trying to accomplish, is he's reacting to, he's sort of reinventing his own language that's intentionally not sort of grammatical within a conventional sort of ontology or ways of, it's intentionally supposed to be not clear. It's supposed to destabilize.
Restructuring language.
Yeah. But the function of language isn't to state truths. He's not trying to provide an alternative language. He's stating truths. So I think of it more like, it's more like his writings are more like a guide to meditation. So I think so that's what they are. It's a different tool.
Really good.
Yeah. So it's like, he's trying to induce through a language that doesn't have truth values, a non-propositional awareness of your body, your presence in the world, the being of things. And the bigger point is just like, that's a lot of where we live, right? Our awareness of others, our awareness of, and he's in using these sort of, it's about being time. It's about, otherness and ready to hand and blah, blah, blah. It's all these concepts. But he's showing the kind of the way in which our ordinary lives are sort of saturated with non-propositional awareness. Now, that's not something, I just said that in sort of very abstract ways as sort of his point, but the point of the reading is almost therapeutic. It's like, instead of doing meditation, the Buddhist version of it is you have these rituals, which could involve skillful activities like archery or whatever, but other rituals could be concentration or mindfulness or whatever. And those are trying to induce a non-propositional awareness of your relationship to the world and your connection with it and stuff like that. So I think of it as, it's like Heidegger is almost like, it's a different tool. It's using language for this to induce this kind of non-propositional awareness. Well, if there's an abstract argument, it's like that's a real thing, right? And it saturates ordinary life, and other things like death.
But also, and Heidegger was really trying to get to the essence of. Isn't he famous for hammers hammering?
Yeah, right. So yes, so our relation, that was one way of he's trying to reorient our understanding of our relationship to ordinary things. So like the way hammer shows up in our consciousness is that it's already seamless with our ways of relating to it. Like as an object is something that, or a doorknob, is a grabbable thing. We don't form beliefs about doorknobs and then think, well, what are my goals? Well, my goals are to enter the room. And then a way of entering the room is by rotating the knob or whatever, like rotating the knob with just a spherical knob, and like by grasping it, so we don't have a whole bunch of beliefs like that. We just have our consciousness is imbued with this seamless way of being oriented to the world, a know-how and attunement to the world. Some people, commentators will use that term talking about it. And that is that when you experience, you're just thinking like, is my friend in the room? And then you see the door, and then you kind of have this seamless relationship with the doorknob. And it doesn't show up for us as a kind of intellectual knowledge.
No, it's how we're interpreting the experiences around it. Phenomenology is it's the study of this phenomena, this experience we have, and it's saying, is a hammer defined by wood and metal and prongs or not prongs, or whatever the thing is that pulls nails out. No, what defines a hammer is it hammers something into wood or whatever you're trying to hammer it into, right? It's the behavior, it's the action, it's the experience of that. The
experience of it as for hammering, and not just like an object that as some other
on the wall.
But the other thing is like I know some Heidegger critics say, well, look, a lot of the more kind of phenomenological stuff in Heidegger is really about death, right? It's about how the big argument in Heidegger is that death is kind of implicitly structuring all of our other experiences. And the way that a lot that goes wrong, a way that we're thrown out of attunement with the sort of ordinary meaning of our life, is because we're in denial about that. I think that's a big argument. I think that's a really important argument, actually.
Fair enough. Yeah, and I think that's a big part of this COVID pandemic.
Yeah.
There's, I think people are utterly confused by death and their relation to it. And you have the lieutenant governor in Texas saying, well, you can take me for the stock market, or, or like there's all these pro-life people saying, hey, we're pro-life with fetuses, but man, if you're going to close the Cheesecake Factory, let's kill the old people. And it's like, what? This makes no sense. This makes no sense. I don't care why. I don't want the big arguments about why, but it's just like, come on, either America, like I was having a theoretical conversation with somebody, and they were talking about those things. And I said, look, if you really want to get utilitarian about this, just look at the US debt clock as a pie chart. I mean, it's like a peace symbol where the two biggest chunks of it are the two of mandatory spending. It's like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, which is basically, and those are the things that, you know, are driving our debt more than anything.
And the military, yeah.
Well, yeah, but military is like, even today with all the wars we've been fighting, and it is like when people talk about spending, right, there's mandatory spending and there's discretionary spending. Military is the biggest component of discretionary spending. But in terms of the overall debt of the United States of America, there are two massive components that if you really want to move the needle, there's only two things you can move. It's Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. You could wipe out all the military spending and you're still not going to touch those two mandatory spending increases that happen every year like clockwork. And I'm not saying we shouldn't cut military spending. I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying, right? And
I just wrote a book about this actually, but about public debt and why it's different. But to connect it with debt, I could argue for a long time about this, but not to get away from that.
My point being, look, you really want to wipe out debt, kill all the old people.
I see. Okay.
Wipe out Social Security and Medicaid, Medicare, right?
Yeah.
I'm not opposed to cutting military spending.
No.
And by the way,
I don't think that's the answer either.
Float in this thing, yeah.
No, I don't think that's the answer. But sorry, let me turn on a light real quick.
You know, by the way, we should have a separate conversation about this and PPP and some other things that are going on. But I guess, you know, the reason I was kind of going there is I think there's a narrative to the United States of America that says we actually take care of the weakest here. We don't, you know, our tribe has this ethos that we, you know, one, I mean, if you believe the Statue of Liberty, you know, and, you know, we want the weakest, we want the poorest, bring them to us. Yeah. We take them here because we think humans are actually inherently valuable.
Yeah, I've been actually really impressed but basically people have spontaneously organize. I mean, put it this way: if you're doing a cost-benefit analysis, is like a version of what you're saying, not in terms of debt, but if you're trying to if you're doing a pure cost-benefit analysis, okay, well, like for all the elderly people that are going to die in the nursing homes, like even if there's a large number of it, they're only expected to live like maybe 10 years on average more, right, or less. So if you put those in qualities as they get called, so a quality of life years remaining, like those are not full lifespans. Those are like, you're just doing their end of life years.
And the most expensive years of their life. I mean, look, they're either going to be in ICU, it's the most expensive way to go, or they're going to be in care. Right. Someone's going to be taking care of them and they're not productive. If you want to go, I mean, I guess whoever goes to Hitler first loses the political argument, but
not anymore. Fascism is back big time. Yeah.
Saying, like, you know, I mean, this is where it starts to feel very Hitler-esque, like, or Stalin-esque or Mao-esque or picture totalitarian, but, you know, put them in camps and end it, because if we're really just worried about utility, then.
Yeah, no, it's like the way that cost-benefit, there's nothing in cost-benefit analysis that is purely utilitarian, like that requires you to not, that it's totally consistent with, so in other words, people fudge, like they'll just like, we'll assign statistical value of a life in the government, like bookkeeping when we're doing cost-benefit analysis, but then there's like heavy thumb in the scales and all these places so that we're not doing what pure utilitarianism would require us to do, right?
Right.
And then there is a sense of that the UK had flirted with this most explicitly, because with the idea that Johnson had floated, which is just get to herd immunity quickly. So the second bounce, and they're kind of experimenting with this too. So just get to herd immunity quickly so that you minimize the death rate on the second bounce, right? That's utilitarian thing. Minimize the death rate and minimize the infringement on economic growth. So like that. And like there is a cost-benefit analysis argument, pure utilitarian, for that view, right? And but it was seen as kind of just unacceptable, not just for like in the sense that the politics wouldn't let you get away with, but just was morally wrong. I thought that was a real testament for the fact that people were going to say, no, let's look out for the vulnerable. Yeah, this is going to cost big time. Unemployment's going to be high. Like a lot of people are going to suffer economically, but we're not going to just kick off grannies and kill off the nursing homes. And I think a reason it helped here a lot is that it's also that everybody was subject to the risk to some degree. So like the risk it's not really, we can't really know. There's also the otherwise healthy, but immunocompromised people, they can go out, but then anybody could have a bad turn with the virus. So that helped, like, so you couldn't sort of be sure that that the
was
risk
just
would be
old people.
limited.
Yeah,
Like,
just people
that was just like, that might have changed a lot, but I think that's traditionally the kind of more egalitarian, like after the Great Depression, you know, when there was big the Gilded Age wealth distribution, which is like what we have now, but the rich were wiped out at the time, right? So like after the Great Depression, the sense was like poverty can happen to anybody, right?
yeah,
So I mean, because it did happen to like, you know, everyone, you know,
yeah,
so that, and even the people who weren't completely impoverished, they didn't feel like, well, I'm invulnerable, right? So structurally, it's a similar kind of thing. Everybody's subject to the risk. Some people are subject to a lot more of it. And I think at that point, people were willing, like, okay, we're going to accept some really big social costs in terms of economic output, and maybe mitigate them in various ways through public, you know, policy. But for the most part, we haven't done a lot of stuff that we can do in that way, both prevent, especially in terms of prevention, but even on the back end as a response. But even still, people are like, okay, this is what we got to do to not take out nursing homes and not kill off the immunocompromised, and then maybe a bunch of like freak, you know, then okay, we're going to do it. I've been amazed actually that I felt like sort of morally when if you put the right weight on risk imposition and you do the right, I mean, I can go through the moral theory about all this, but I think it worked. Like there's a pretty good moral argument for the way we've been doing it, but I wouldn't have bet ahead of time. Like if I were analyzing like sort of pandemic morality, like doing a section in an ethics course on that, you know, like I would have made the arguments. I would have done utilitarianism, and then I would have done like a more comparative contractualist risk imposition theory, and then like maybe I would have defended what we're doing, but I would not have guessed that we would like spontaneously do it. You know, like it's kind of amazing. Yeah.
It's remarkable, and I think it's an ongoing experiment, right? We'll see what happens.
No doubt we're overshooting to some degree, and it's totally varies with location, but like,
well, no, yeah, and I'm not even saying, I mean, I think, you know, look, we don't know if there's going to be a second bounce. And a lot of times in pandemics, you have this first soft wave like we're having right now, and people are like, oh, it's fine, let's go back out. And then, you know, like the Imperial College of London, who gave us the 2.2 million deaths if we don't do anything, with 50 World Health Organization experts. I mean, these are basically, this is like the statistical gold standard in the world right now, which is, I think, what gave Trump pause and his, or at least his advisors who could read pause, and the UK pause.
Yeah.
And say, whoa, we don't want to double the death rate in our countries for a lot of reasons. I mean, not just the number of coffins, but you can't.
Right. Yeah. I thought that was the thing, is because of the uncertainty about how bad it would be, and then also the risk of exponentially accelerating like death rate where you just have no idea how high that goes. That's the thing, is just scary as hell. That's now we feel like, okay, we know the social distancing works, and we know we can bend the curve. And now it's like a much more like less terrifying situation, I think. But that was that accelerate the uncertainty about how bad it would be, because that's actually relevant from a cost benefit point of view, because if you can't be sure about the probabilities you're assigning to the different outcomes, because it's just uncertain, and you could wind up in like this completely awful, you know, like even the UK model, the idea was like to minimize the death rate over time and protect economic growth. They were going to use the schools. They're going to close and open schools to like manage the risk profile. But the idea that like this is like going to work
on the front line, yeah.
You know, speaking of Burke, you know, like it's pretty like the idea that this like that we're going to be able to like exactly optimize like the right like school closures and openings to get the risk level just right, so we get to herd immunity as fast as possible and keep Becker. The idea that that's like a feasible economic, I mean, it has to be England. It would never happen in America. It's just too creaky of a political system.
No, well, you know, yeah, I also say, like, I mean, it's the Keynesian problem, right? Like, look, I appreciate John Milton Keynes, and I appreciate the idea of, you know, trim tabs to kind of fine tune economies. But when you're talking about trim tabs on a super tanker, you know, okay, yeah, you can refine a little bit that way. You're not this isn't like a sports car, you know, going down S turns. And I think
I can tell you about the book I just wrote with a guy. He's a Cornell financial law professor. He used to work for the New York Fed and the IMF. And then a lot of the book, the most original stuff in the book is new reforms to the Fed, so that it can do better fine tuning for inflation management, so that government can spend more, which all spending creates new money, and then taxes and borrowing pull it out of the economy. But you don't have to. But you have a much more control over inflation, more so than even Milton Friedman thought you could have, by these other measures of fine tuning that the Fed can start using. It started doing some of them, but they can do it more robustly. But not that there's perfect timing, but especially on something that's done on the fly, like pandemic management is like,
well, also we look at, you also look at Japan and Europe, right? I mean, when you get into negative interest rates and massive deflation over 3 decades, you start to say, okay, there's a limit to yes, there's a lot of impact that the Fed can have on the benefit to an economy. And
not so much with just adjusting its main tool, like adjusting interest rates. That's not like that tool has become less effective. And now it doesn't even use that as much because it just pays interest on big bank reserves directly. So, well, I mean, I could mention like a couple of the things. One of the big ones it can do is expand. It now does open market. It buys and sells assets, or it expanded the mortgage-backed securities purchases to put a floor on the housing market.
Yep.
So Bernanke started doing that, and the Fed just revived that. But it could do that in normal times persistently by putting both a floor and a ceiling on housing prices. And then each of the sectors, each price sector, it can do open market operations based on the daily data. It can just buy and sell assets to collar those prices with a floor and a ceiling. So in that case, like it doesn't even need a model to predict inflation, like Phillips curve's business, which now is kind of mostly been
outdated,
regarded as not really useful. So it can be more of a bench scientist kind of approach, like fine tuning an engine instead of having an abstract economic model. It's just based on the daily price movement data. It buys and sells assets as like a whale purchaser, right? It just operates in the markets like a market player.
Market driven by machines. Yeah, I mean, you have it with ETFs, you have it with Feds. I mean, and for guys like me, I operating a small public company, or my wife does a lot of daily trades. You start to see these big pressures, these massive ETF pressures that it's like a big tide that pushes things down, and you start to say, wait a minute, there's nuggets in here that are really mispriced. But anyways, I'm not sure that's here or there.
Watching those larger trends. I mean, so there's a way the Fed can influence those trends. It's not necessarily picking winners or it's just setting parameters.
It's like a tide, right?
Yeah, like it can be buoying up or pushing down, like on price. And then right now there is hyper-inflated assets, and it can tamp those down, and the other ones that are lower so a bit more fine tuning than Friedman. And this isn't even inconsistent with Milton Friedman. It's just that Friedman didn't know about these techniques, and like central banking progresses pretty fast, actually.
You didn't have the technology either, right? I mean, when you have machine learning and artificial intelligence.
And that's the other thing that's like easier with technology now is to change the payment system. Because right now we run the payment system through the private banks. So we all have work with private banks who manage payments to consumers, et cetera, through consumers. And then the big banks have accounts at the central bank. But like another idea we have is just we all just have an account at the central bank, and then the Fed can just do helicopter drops straight into accounts. Like we're going to get a payment, right? We'd already have that money if it was just put into an account. And then you attach an interest rate to our private accounts, the way it attaches an interest rate to the accounts the big banks have, and it adjusts that interest rate to influence saving or spending. So too much spending, raise the influence. So it does exactly directly fine tunes with a more reliable spending partner. Because the problem with the big banks is that you can boost up their balance sheet, but they don't necessarily lend or which creates money. They don't necessarily do it, right? Because they need a business proposition. But you take people like nowadays, it's like not hard to get them to spend money if you get it to them, right? Or if they're spending too much, you can raise an interest rate, and then if there's you can use those accounts if you have a bigger inflationary problem. You can also announce what's the equivalent of rationing as an impound. So money that will be put in there, those accounts just as can't be spent, or some portion of it, for a certain period of time, right? So that's like a way of before you go to like a Volcker big interest rate hike, you can sort of announce like those impounds on accounts. So so there's a lot of these tools that the Fed could be equipped with, so that it could
possible now. That wasn't possible before, right?
Right. So, and you can do this on blockchain platform or other new technology. The payment technologies now are coming out, and central banks are already, like Singapore has been ahead of the curve. Other central banks are either adopting them or using them to retool the payment system. And nowadays, like for example, my co-author, for example, it's consistent with our book, but he just now wrote legislation which takes, the Treasury already allows any citizen to open a Treasury account for buying and selling Treasury securities, like in 10 minutes takes to open it. So if those could be recognized like payments, they could recognize a vehicle that is like Treasury dollar that gets issued through that. And if everyone were to open those, you could have basically like, and then there's like a Venmo type, public Venmo that allows peer-to-peer transactions, like for both directions. That technology is easy, like Silicon Valley partners could help set that up. So he's now got legislation that might actually wind up in the next stimulus bill, but like, so, and then the Fed, if the Fed is recognizing those accounts, that's like a way of working with building out to the bigger idea. So that might actually happen, but the technology is like super straightforward for that to work right now. You don't need the big banks as managing the payment system.
So where I'm wrong on that, and I think you're right, is with the new technology that's available and moving from basically a sort of Republican version of banking to a direct democracy version of banking, you actually would have trim tabs that could make direct impacts on consumer behavior and spending and saving.
Yeah, right. No, and so it's well, there's a way in which it's more Republican in the small r sense, because right now we're subject to the arbitrary decisions of the big banks as quasi public private entities who may or may not appreciate their public responsibilities by being chartered and they have the ability to create dollars from nothing, which are recognized. They may or may not have a sense of like what that means.
Yes, it sounds like members of Congress.
Yeah. So like in some sense, we've charged them with these tremendous responsibilities in the monetary system.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily, they think, no, just leave it all to the markets. We have no responsibility. They just disavowed it. So we're subject to their arbitrary, profiteering decisions.
Right.
And so the answer to that isn't to get rid of the big banks, but to rely less on them so that we're less dependent on their arbitrary. That's classical Republican thought. It's just like not being subject to arbitrary will of, and you can do that by a better balance of public and private. Because right now we're, so you have the public bank part of the banking system just takes more responsibility. Then we're less dependent on the private piece. But you could still have private banking systems, so we're not totally dependent on public banking either. So it's like then we have greater liberty in the strict sense that like you have a choice,
more choices.
You have a choice. Everybody has a public account, and if you don't like the private banks stealing your data and selling it or whatever, then you can rely on that. But if you don't like the idea that government bureaucrats could potentially get your financial information or only so much of it, so you can use the private accounts, and then they need there's a different legal process for getting access. So that's a liberty enhancing move by just having like a better dynamic between public and private.
It sounds like a bicameral approach to banking.
Yeah, right. No, it is like, so you're balancing the kind of,
right. Yeah,
you're offsetting the excesses of the other, with the other one. Yeah. So like, I mean, there's no replacing regulation of the kind we already have, but this package is a lot better than the one we have, and the one we have is mostly just a result of the political compromises that were needed to get the Fed established back in 1913. So basically you had to buy out JP Morgan, and who was really influential with the other Wall Street speculators, and they were willing to agree to the public-private partnership we have, but basically where they got a lot of special advantages, right? You couldn't fully, basically we did socialize the dollar in 1913, and then that became, when they dropped in 1933, the conversion, FDR dropped the convertibility, dropped the gold standard for domestic versions. Then the central bank really became empowered. But you had the dollar was the first time a publicly issued and managed entity. So that was the first time you had fully public money. But to get that going, it was through this kind of hybrid system. And a lot of that, part of it was because of payment, technology, because the banks were running the payments. To a large degree, and they were managing credit to a large degree. They'd been regulated since the 1860s, because that was the first time there were national standards. It was only then there weren't where it was before that was Wild West, but because we. Yeah,
I mean, it started with Alexander. Alexander Hamilton kind of set up a national banking, but it was very rudimentary and very early, and we had colonies, and and then of course.
So Hamilton's bank was the first, and that would have become a public bank, and then there was a second installment of it, but it got dismantled by the southern states because they didn't like the incipient sort of federalism.
Right.
So it was only when they were,
Federalists, yeah.
it's only when the southern states lost their voting rights because of the Civil War, that then Abraham Lincoln adopted all these monetary reforms, that you didn't get a public bank yet, you just got national standards. So that was like early 1860s, there was a bunch of versions. That was the first time. You also had greenbacks being issued as the first like national paper money. And then before that, like private banks were all issuing dollars, their own dollars. There was like a Goldman Sachs dollar, there was a Bank of America dollar, Wild Earp Bank dollar, you know, Billy the Kid Sidewinder Bank dollar. These are all different dollars that traded at different parities.
If you go to Scotland today, you'll get a pound from every bank in Scotland.
Oh, okay. Yeah, right. Yeah. But I mean, that was only the first time that was harmonized, when there was public standards, so you could get a national backing for it. And that they didn't even ban privately issued dollars. They didn't even rule it out. It's just that once there was like there was like a dollar that was worth $1, people were like, why mess with anything else? So they went for okay. So that was in the 1860s, but that was still first time you had national standards, but you still didn't have a full public management, because you still had the gold standard during that. Well, short after that period was when the gold standard kicked in, and that restrained like any sort of ability to public manage, or the gold standard was the only public managing.
Yeah, you had the value of $1 tied to the value of gold, and
right,
FDR
the increase in the supply of gold would emerge because of arbitrary changes, like whether it's discoveries in California or Australia or South Africa, was depending on like whether they got lucky digging up, you know, rocks out of the ground.
What's the gold supply? Yeah.
That didn't have to do with the needs of the economy, right? So like the gold supply did increase, but at this halting level, and the result, you had a constant deflationary crises throughout that whole period. There was like a whole series of them. It was only because they finally got, especially the Panic of 1906 was a big one, that finally created a sense, and the idea that the private bankers couldn't be trusted anymore, that you really finally got a consensus around
probably a sound idea.
No, they literally it was, so it was the first time there was a public bank, but even then, because the private banks had such a hold on the economy, JP Morgan, for example, a political hold, that they still had to be sort of brought in as sort of quasi-public role, like, and have all these special privileges, have advising, get seniorage, free money, you know, kind of.
It's like Goldman Sachs today, right? I mean, Goldman Sachs.
We still have a lot of all of the big banks, insofar as they're chartered that they have powers to create dollars from nothing, meaning their lending decisions, which just create dollars, get recognized by the Fed as dollar creation. So they have this public power of money creation. And it's actually one of our main ways that we create money, aside from federal spending, is through lending, right? Through private bank lending. But that's all through a like publicly authorized system that was established back then.
Yeah,
but they don't.
And you also have these revolving doors too, right? I mean, the head of JP Morgan is going to become the Treasury Secretary or some version of that, right? Fannie and Freddie.
Right.
I mean, look, I'm not.
I wouldn't even be against that if the bankers in the private markets understood like deeply the public responsibilities that their firms have, but then they often don't. And it's only when like there's an emergency, like Hank Paulson did a lot of the right things, for example, like, so they like suddenly like, no, there's no atheists in foxholes. And so like whatever they thought about, like however they rationalized their private market privileges, you know, free market, blah, blah, blah. Okay, forget it. We just have to like suddenly now government, you know, like, so, or someone like Bernanke was like, as a historian, was less tied to that kind of thinking. And so I think he could adapt better. So I wouldn't even have a problem with like people who would have expertise from being within the financial markets, if they're the kind of people that actually understand the public role and responsibilities. But I know, for example, that doesn't always, like, I know my colleague who's like, you know, he rolls pretty deep in finance and law circles, and he just was talking with the head of BlackRock the other day, and he was saying things that BlackRock is just got adopted with tremendous new public responsibilities for managing like the corporate, like basically the Fed's like backing like all corporate balance sheets, the whole sector's like right crazy, and like BlackRock's being enlisted to help with that, right? With all these kind of with including the ability to like basically give itself money by its own discretion, like
right.
But so Bob, my co-author, was just talking to one of the heads of BlackRock, and he was just saying these really dismissive things about the public sector and like really poo-pooing, and it's just suggesting that he didn't have any sense of the public responsibilities he was now being entrusted with. Well, that's a problem. Yeah.
Look, I would say the hardest point about look, if you've, and this is, there's been a number of books written about this, but, if you've, once you've gone to an elite educational institution, and you've probably married somebody who went to an elite institution, and you're in this kind of higher echelon of society, and you get to a point where you're ahead of whatever at BlackRock, or you're 2 or 3 generations deep into private jets and private experiences, and however you live your life with everybody catering to you all the time. The idea of empathy is really hard. And I'm not even blaming the people in and of themselves, but if you've, to our earlier conversation about the reasons you go and live in a homestay in Indonesia, if you can't relate to grinding poverty, if you understand why multiple generations, I think Hillbilly Elegy is one of the great books of our era. If you can't relate to the problems of endemic poverty and grinding poverty and how that damages society, if you don't understand that at all, have no experience with it, and can't see it, it's like the RBG documentary. I mean, her biggest argument wasn't whether or not women should have equal rights. It was helping white male judges coming from privilege from the elite institutions of America see that the fact that women didn't have the same opportunities that men did, because they couldn't see it sitting from where they were.
Yeah, I was going to say that's not, well, the privilege just definitely has a tendency you mentioned, I think, but a lot of it is just like ideas, convenient ideas that start to function like ideology or conventional wisdom that people just lose track of their meaning. Now, this happens like not just within the financial markets, where they're not spending all day like trying to advance the sum of human knowledge, like the best economic or political economy, but even within the universities, especially during like before 2008, this, like the whole economics profession was corrupted in this way. They themselves, partly by being excessively focused on formalisms, or even like business schools, which did a lot to propagate basically very rudimentary kind of economic thinking. It was just a mishmash of basically political ideology, about markets, and like that. It's not savvy, wise stuff about like how to balance market and state and what the best, most effective. Like that was all dropped out of the wisdom, loss of history, historical understanding. I mean, so this, like even their own philosophical assumptions, they lost track of all that stuff. And so like within the economic profession, which partly was catering to the markets. And I saw this, I was at Harvard during that period, and where I was just trying to like I started working on international trade to some degree like then. So I was like getting pretty into economics and figuring out, okay, what's really known as a matter of like well-established science and what's just philosophy. And I'm like, shit, this is like bullshit. These are philosophical presuppositions traveling as science, which are just, or that are politically convenient for some, that are just dogmatic and unquestioned for others. So,
people like making it up. Yeah, no, it's completely.
Yeah. I mean, they're like ideas that that have elements of truth, but like people have long since lost track of the parameters for those truths, and like and the difference it makes when it shift. And so like now, actually, even since then, the thing that I was worried about with the economics have shifted a lot, not completely, but after the crisis and stuff. So. Or even just things like, you wouldn't even think this, but like a big part of the economics profession does not understand how monetary operations work. They don't understand the accounting. So think about that. That's like, unless the person did a side gig in like central banking, or they've done an independent study because they had like special research interests, it's the central bankers are the ones who really know like how the accounting and the monetary system works, and they're much less afflicted by the ideologies, assumptions that people work with in the universities. I mean, so the universities, they have. So
it's a very utilitarian discipline, monetary policy that's completely disconnected from any us.
Right, they're just like plumbers. Like how do you fix a sink? It's like, well, you dig around and look at the sink and you think about
those guys over there, and these guys will be dry. Yeah, no.
Yeah, right. So it's much more practical. Like all kinds of things. If you say, "Can you do this?" They'll be like, "Oh yeah, we can do it," but I don't know if it's consistent with the legal mandate, or like, there's all these workarounds. Like even now with the things the Fed doing with all these new facilities, those stuff are all like they're basically accounting gimmicks that are used to stretch the legal mandate for the emergency purposes. Right. But the accounting can be much more straightforward in how the liabilities get where they get booked and how they get shifted. It's not that straightforward. Like you don't even need to have Treasury ponying up a certain amount of money so that the Fed is just leveraging. It's like, you don't even need all that. That's just a way of creating like some sense of shared liability, like, so, but like the economics profession as a rule, with some exceptions, they do not study this stuff. They do not know. Larry Summers does not know how that fucking stuff works. Well, he does not know.
Totally agree. And I'd argue this. I mean, I think this is where I was kind of wanting to come to closure on some of this. There's been this idea that education is about utility, right? You get an education so you can get a job, so you can do this work, get a paycheck, have a good life. And there's been a massive disconnect. We've had these big, with the Enlightenment, we have these big increases in our ability to do things, to practice medicine, to practice, biomedicine and all these, cloning. There's a million different versions of it, but it also happens in monetary policy. It also happens in engineering. It happens in all kinds of different parts of our world. And where I think, I'm a huge fan of the humanities, and I studied ethics and in philosophy, as well as I love continental philosophy. But I think when you disconnect the ethos from the action, when you disconnect just fundamentally the ethic from the work, you can end up with horrific, the unintended consequences can be horrific.
And there's ways in which like people becoming insular and hyper specialized, even who know a lot, can suddenly not know what's really important, and be really out of attunement with.
Well, you end up with Adolf Eichmann. I mean, Adolf Eichmann was the monster of the Third Reich who decided who went to which camp.
All right, yeah.
But when they actually put him in the dock, and Hannah Arendt, did her study of it later, she was like, Adolf Eichmann wasn't some big monster. We were expecting this horrible man who was, strategically figuring out how to destroy Jews. He was a guy who just didn't want to get fired from his job.
He's a bureaucrat, yeah.
Yeah, he was just an ethicless bureaucrat trying not to get fired and couldn't say no to the bandwagon. And, ultimately, his claim, which is the famous one, that I was just doing my job. Well, you get hung from your job if you do it the wrong way. And I think, I think today, and I was going to ask you this question, but I'll just posit it instead. I think today more than ever, philosophy's role, the generalist role in an economy as sophisticated as the one we live on is more important than ever. And, if we don't have an ethic attached to these powerful tools that we have that are becoming more powerful by the moment, we can create a world that will destroy us. And going back to Satya Nadella, he was talking about artificial intelligence and, the problem of machines, and, Terminator is the one that everyone thinks of, where the machines destroy the world, or the Matrix. He said, look, the great thing about our ability right now is we can create the rules for these machines that will become increasingly powerful and pretty quickly become more powerful than we can think or process, or the speeds we can. If we build the ethical system for these machines to operate in, conceptually we can protect ourselves. But if we don't, if we're just doing it for utility, then we will find ourselves in the Matrix or in some Terminator construct where the machines pretty quickly figure out we are the cancer in this world, and we probably are the thing that needs to be eradicated. And that's, to me, that's fun.
No, I think that's right. I mean, like one good thing about the reminder that the pandemic brings is that, like so much of like public planning and organizing society is about planning for risks and including like technology shocks or AI shocks for unemployment. We're not prepared for any of that stuff.
Right.
I mean, at all. And so like, but it's sort of, instead of having like a sense of entitlement, we're just entitled to all the achievements of the advanced world. We've got them, and that's how they're supposed to be. And that's our fucking liberty. And like, I'm getting a haircut when I want to, I'm
gonna have a political protest with an assault weapon, because that's
right. So like that attitude, I mean, that's the more extreme version, but the other one is just being really, really resistant to have to adapt. But like, look, these are real achievements, and then if we want to keep them, and for the longer run, you have to have much more of a precautionary macro prudence is the new, since 2008, the more term for financial markets, but much more of like what government has to be about is working with markets and private sector and society so that we have like like a more adaptable society so that we can deal with these shocks, like reduce them. I mean, if we love liberty, then you got to keep it in this way. It's like, there's not a given, right? You want liberty, you want prosperity, we want to stay rich, we want to have our time at the beach, you know, like we want to, like all the things that are like, were great about America when America was great, or like, you know, like those are all things you have to plan for. So we have to have a more attuned relationship with our environment and the risks that we're facing, and then a more like precautionary attitude about how to manage those things, and more adaptable, like more fine tuning in a way, like, and that I think our models that we've been worked with for the like late 20th century were all out of whack with all that stuff. Just none of those.
It was too one-dimensional, and I think your point about attunement is it's the multi-dimensional world we live in. It's hard to define, and really kind of the only way we can really define it is by being in it and being in the moment, and spending tens of thousands of hours finding our positions to the world we live in.
Yeah, cool.
I really appreciate this time, Aaron. This has been
really fun.
Yeah, let's go surf.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, where are you surfing right now? Newport mainly?
I've been going to, I mean, I'm always a little secretive about where I'm going, but
okay.
No, that's all right. It doesn't matter. I've been going to North Gravels when it's bigger. No, that's all right. Yeah, I've been going to Creek, North Gravels when it's bigger, you know, and then I go to like Newport or Huntington, I guess, more or less. Yeah.
Oh yeah, right, the usual.
Well, let's connect.
Yeah, let's totally surf. Yeah.
I really appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining the Kick Aspirational podcast.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, you're gonna do this all as one thing.
Oh, this is gonna be an epic load of awesome.
All right, just warn people. Yeah, they can sit down and drink, do it all. Yeah.
Yeah. No, this. People break these up. It's good. This has been a fantastic journey. Thank you for the time. I want to do another session with you. Just doing a series of specific questions around "Am I the asshole?" and some of them will be some of mine, and some will be some of others. But I think it'd be a lot of fun if you don't mind doing it.
Yeah, no, that'd be fun. Yeah, totally. Yeah,
Super
right on.
Cool.
Cool.
Thanks, Aaron.
Okay.